Have you ever felt like you're performing a role in your own life, rather than living it? Have you sensed that the normal world around you operates according to rules no one can explain, yet everyone insists you follow? Have you wondered whether the systems we navigate daily might be designed not to serve us, but to trap us? These questions haunted a solitary insurance clerk in early 20th century Prague. Franz Kafka filled notebooks with stories of men who wake up as insects, defendants who never learn their crimes, and seekers who spend lifetimes trying to enter buildings that remain forever closed to them. What appeared to be surreal fiction was actually philosophy of the highest order, a complete system of thought about what it means to be human in the modern world. Kafka gave us the language for modern existential anxiety. When we describe something as Kafkaesque, we're invoking his unique understanding of being trapped in systems beyond our comprehension or control. This isn't merely about bureaucratic inefficiency. It's about the fundamental condition of modern existence, where invisible forces shape our lives according to rules we can never fully grasp. A defendant stands trial without knowing his crime. A land surveyor arrives in a village to do work that may not exist for a castle that may not want him. These scenarios have become essential vocabulary for describing contemporary life because Kafka identified the core structure of modern alienation decades before others recognized it. Born in Prague in 1883, Kafka inhabited multiple contradictions that would shape his philosophical vision. He was a German-speaking Jew in a Czech city, caught between languages and cultures within the dying Austro-Hungarian Empire. By day, he processed insurance claims for industrial accidents, cataloging human suffering in bureaucratic forms. By night, he explored how these same bureaucratic structures had become the dominant force shaping human consciousness. His relationship with his domineering father, his position as a cultural outsider, and his intimate knowledge of institutional machinery combined to produce insights that anticipated existentialism and provided the most accurate diagnosis of modernity's spiritual costs. His major works function as philosophical investigations rather than conventional literature. The Metamorphosis explores how transformation can be both liberation and trap. Gregor Samsa's metamorphosis into an insect reveals the dehumanizing forces already at work in his life as a traveling salesman. The trial examines guilt as a structural feature of consciousness itself. Josef discovers that innocence is impossible in a world where the very act of existing makes one complicit in systems of power. The castle investigates the search for transcendence and belonging. K, the land surveyor, spends the entire novel trying to reach authorities who may not acknowledge his existence. These aren't separate stories, but components of a unified philosophical system. Kafka understood that modern bureaucratic society functions as a form of secular theology, with invisible authorities dispensing incomprehensible judgments according to unknowable laws. He saw that guilt had become the fundamental structure of modern consciousness. Not guilt for specific acts, but guilt for the crime of existing in a world that demands constant justification. He recognized that transformation, which should represent growth and possibility, had become another trap in a society that transforms people into functions rather than allowing authentic becoming. Most remarkably, Kafka developed a complex spiritual vision that acknowledged God's apparent absence whilst maintaining that this absence itself might be meaningful. His characters seek transcendence not through traditional religious channels, but through engagement with the very systems that seem designed to prevent such seeking. The castle that K tries to reach may be empty, but the attempt to reach it becomes a form of spiritual practice. The trial that Joseph K undergoes may be absurd, but his engagement with it reveals truths about the nature of existence itself. This philosophical system anticipated the major themes of 20th century thought, whilst providing resources for understanding our current predicament. Part 1. The Architecture of Alienation. When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning from unsettling dreams, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. This opening sentence of the Metamorphosis establishes something profound about Kafka's understanding of modern existence. The horror isn't the transformation itself, but how matter-of-factly it's presented. Kafka reveals that modern work and family structures already make us monstrous to ourselves and others. The insect form simply makes visible what was already true about Gregor's existence as a traveling salesman, supporting his family. The transformation is shocking precisely because it literalizes a condition that was already present, but hidden beneath the veneer of normal social functioning. Kafka presents alienation as ontological rather than merely economic, cutting deeper than Marx's analysis of worker exploitation. Gregor's immediate concern isn't his grotesque new body but missing work, showing how completely he has internalized his role as economic provider. What a strenuous career it is that one's chosen. Traveling about day in and day out, he thinks. Even as he struggles with his insect limbs, this reveals how we become foreign to our own being, through social roles that demand we suppress our authentic nature. The transformation doesn't create alienation, it exposes the alienation that was already total. Gregor had already ceased to exist as himself, becoming merely a function in an economic system. The family's horror reflects society's inability to recognize our authentic selves when they emerge from behind social masks. His sister Gret initially shows compassion, bringing him food and cleaning his room, but gradually turns against him as his transformation becomes permanent rather than temporary inconvenience. The family's disgust isn't really about his appearance, but about their investment in maintaining the fiction that we are only our social roles. When Gregor's father drives him back into his room with apples, one becomes embedded in his back, a wound that never heals, representing the permanent damage inflicted by social rejection of authentic selfhood. Yet, Kafka presents alienation as both trap and potential awakening. Gregor's transformation destroys his social existence, but also frees him from the demands of work and social performance. He discovers newfound appreciation for music when he hears his sister playing violin, suggesting that alienation from social roles might enable connection to deeper sources of meaning. His death becomes liberation, not just for his family, but potentially for himself, raising the profound question of whether authentic existence requires the death of our social selves. The Metamorphosis reveals that we are already transformed by modernity. The question is whether we can recognize this condition and find meaning within it. Franz Kafka understood that we become strangers to ourselves long before the world rejects us. His characters reveal how deeply we depend on social roles for our sense of identity, constructing elaborate performances that feel like authentic selfhood but collapse the moment external recognition fails. Consider Gregor Samsa, who defines himself entirely as traveling salesman. This isn't merely his job. It becomes the totality of his self-understanding. When he wakes transformed, his first concern isn't his monstrous body but missing the morning train. The role has consumed the person so completely that even metamorphosis cannot immediately break its hold. Similarly, Josef K., in the trial, exists primarily as bank employee, his identity so bound to institutional function that accusations against him feel like attacks on reality itself. This role-based identity provides false stability because it depends entirely on external recognition. Others must acknowledge and validate our performance for it to feel real. Gregor's family treats him as breadwinner, Josef K's colleagues see him as competent banker. These reflections create the mirror in which they recognize themselves. Kafka wrote in his diary, "One am nothing but literature, and can and want to be nothing else," revealing his own struggle with this dynamic. Even he could only understand himself through external categories, through what others might recognize as his function. The catastrophe arrives when recognition fails. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor attempts to speak to the chief clerk, but produces only incomprehensible sounds. This moment creates existential vertigo. The gap between inner experience and outer appearance becomes unbridgeable. Gregor knows what he wants to communicate, feels the familiar impulses of explanation and persuasion, but the social machinery of recognition breaks down completely. The chief clerk flees not from Gregor's appearance alone, but from this failure of mutual understanding that makes normal human interaction impossible. This breakdown reveals that identity was always unstable, constructed through social performance, rather than grounded in essential selfhood. Characters experience this revelation as a form of madness or unreality, because they've never questioned the foundations of their self-understanding. When the performance fails, they discover there was nothing underneath, no core self that existed independently of social recognition. Yet Kafka shows us something profound. Self-alienation precedes social alienation. His characters become strangers to themselves before others reject them. Gregor examines his transformed body in the mirror with clinical curiosity, observing his new limbs and movements with detachment rather than horror. This self-estrangement enables him to observe his own condition with an almost scientific objectivity unavailable to those fully identified with their social roles. This detachment reveals a troubling truth about normal identity formation. We become strangers to ourselves through the very process of social integration. What we call authentic selfhood is actually complex performance requiring constant maintenance and external validation. When Gregor's family discusses him in the third person whilst he listens from his room, his social identity continues existing even though he can no longer inhabit it. They speak of the traveling salesman as though he still exists somewhere, trapped inside the insect body. Kafka's analysis leads to disturbing questions about authentic selfhood beyond social recognition. If our normal identity depends on others acknowledging our performance of acceptable roles, what remains when that acknowledgement disappears? His characters suggest that we might discover aspects of ourselves that exist independently of social validation. But this discovery comes at the cost of everything we previously understood as normal human existence. The stranger in the mirror isn't the transformed body. It's the self we never knew was there, watching our social performances with alien eyes. Gregor Samstra awakens transformed, desperate to explain his predicament to the chief clerk standing outside his door. He speaks, believing his words will clarify everything. Yet what emerges is a painful and uncontrollable squeaking mixed in with it. The words could be made out at first, but then there was a sort of echo which made them unclear. This scene crystallizes Kafka's profound insight into the architecture of modern alienation. We share vocabulary and grammar with others, yet find ourselves utterly unable to communicate our essential experiences. The failure runs deeper than misunderstanding. Gregor possesses the same language as his family and employer, yet the moment he attempts to convey his inner reality, language itself becomes the obstacle. His words transform into sounds that others cannot interpret as meaningful communication. This transformation mirrors the broader predicament Kafka identifies throughout his work. Language has become a barrier rather than a bridge between consciousness. Josef K. experiences this linguistic entrapment most acutely in the trial. He attempts repeatedly to explain his innocence, to articulate the absurdity of his situation, yet finds that legal discourse transforms his every word into evidence of guilt. The advocate provides endless explanations that clarify nothing, whilst creating the impression of expertise and progress. Legal language operates through its own internal logic, making individual experience literally incomprehensible within its framework. The priest's explanation reveals the circular nature of this linguistic trap. The court wants nothing from you. It receives you when you come and dismisses you when you go. This statement demonstrates how institutional language creates meaning through self-referential logic that excludes genuine communication. The court's language does not engage with Josef K's actual situation, but instead generates its own reality, where his protests become confirmation of the very guilt he denies. Bureaucratic discourse operates as a system of control rather than communication. Characters find themselves speaking in ways that betray their intentions. Their words, captured and redirected by institutional frameworks they never consciously accepted. When Josef K. speaks to court officials, he must adopt their terminology and assumptions to be understood at all. Yet this adoption means accepting categories that predetermine his guilt. The language itself becomes complicit in his persecution. This linguistic predicament reveals how authority systems exploit the gap between inner experience and public expression. Institutions provide the only available vocabulary for discussing certain experiences, yet this vocabulary inevitably distorts those experiences to serve institutional purposes. The individual finds themselves speaking against their own interests, whilst believing they are advocating for themselves. Kafka suggests that authentic communication might require abandoning conventional language altogether. Gregor's sister playing violin creates understanding without words. Her music conveys emotions and meanings that speech cannot approach. The wordless recognition between characters who share similar predicaments often proves more genuine than elaborate verbal exchanges. These moments point toward communication beyond language, suggesting that our most profound connections transcend the linguistic frameworks that typically mediate human interaction. The tension between language's necessity for human connection and its simultaneous failure to convey what matters most creates the fundamental alienation of modern existence. We require language to reach others, yet language consistently betrays our deepest intentions. Kafka reveals how this predicament leaves individuals isolated within shared linguistic communities, speaking the same words whilst inhabiting entirely different realities of meaning and experience. Part 2. The Machinery of Authority. Someone must have been telling lies about Josef K. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but one morning, he was arrested. This opening line of the trial establishes the fundamental paradox that haunts modern legal systems. NEN. Guilt precedes accusation, and innocence becomes irrelevant to legal proceedings. K's absolute certainty of his innocence, his rational confidence that he has committed no crime, becomes meaningless within a system that operates according to its own internal logic. Rather than any correspondence to actual wrongdoing, the arrest happens not because evidence exists against him, but because the machinery of law has already determined his guilt as its starting point. This reversal reveals how judicial authority functions in modernity, not as a mechanism for discovering truth, but as a self-perpetuating system that creates the very criminality it claims to address. The court system that ensnares K represents judicial authority that is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. K discovers that court sessions happen in tenement attics, that judges and lawyers inhabit the same squalid spaces as defendants, yet the court's power remains absolute despite its shabby appearances. The painter Titorelli explains to Kay that there are three possibilities for any case: definite acquittal, ostensible acquittal, and protraction. But definite acquittal exists only in theory. No one has ever witnessed it. Ostensible acquittal requires starting the entire process again from the beginning, whilst protraction keeps the case permanently suspended at its lowest level. This reveals a system designed not to deliver justice, but to perpetuate itself indefinitely. The court's authority derives not from its ability to resolve cases, but from its capacity to maintain them in permanent suspension, creating a legal machinery that feeds on the very problems it pretends to solve. Legal guilt within this system precedes any specific accusation, making existence itself criminal within the court's logic. Kay's desperate attempts to discover his crime only entangle him deeper in legal procedures that assume his guilt as their foundational premise. He encounters other defendants who have been trapped in the system for years without ever learning their charges, their lives consumed by endless legal preparations for trials that never arrive. The court criminalizes the very act of living. Takes any word he speaks, any decision he makes, can be interpreted as evidence of guilt by a system that begins with the assumption of criminality. His work at the bank suffers because he must attend to legal matters. His neglect of legal matters becomes evidence of his disrespect for the court. The system creates a totalizing logic where innocence becomes impossible because existence itself violates the court's unstated but absolute laws. The search for justice through legal channels becomes complicity in one's own judicial oppression. K transforms from a confident bank employee into an anxious defendant who gradually internalizes the court's logic, beginning to question his own innocence despite knowing he has committed no crime. His attempts to prove his innocence require accepting the court's authority to judge him, creating a double bind where both resistance and compliance serve the system's interests. When he hires a lawyer, he becomes dependent on legal expertise that prolongs his case indefinitely. When he considers dismissing the lawyer, he risks appearing disrespectful to the court. Every strategy for defending himself strengthens the system that oppresses him. His final execution, where he dies like a dog, represents the complete absorption of the individual into legal machinery that destroys him whilst maintaining its own legitimacy. The shame that survives him is not his own but the system's, yet it becomes attached to his name, demonstrating how judicial authority transforms its own failures into the guilt of those it destroys. Kafka's bureaucratic institutions function as complete worldviews that systematically reduce human beings to documentation through administrative logic. In the trial, discovers that his case files contain pornographic pictures mixed with legal documents. We witness how bureaucratic categories corrupt and distort human reality whilst claiming objective neutrality. The pornography isn't accidental contamination. It reveals how administrative systems process human complexity into their own terms, creating grotesque distortions whilst maintaining the pretense of neutral classification. Characters become their documentation. What exists in the files becomes more real than the living person. The bureaucracy succeeds not through efficiency, but by making its logic the only acceptable form of reasoning about human existence. This worldview extends infinitely upward through organizational hierarchy. making ultimate administrative authority permanently unreachable. K's attempts to reach higher court officials reveal endless layers of intermediaries, each claiming the next level is inaccessible. The advocate explains that the proceedings gradually merge into the judgment, showing how the process becomes its own justification. There is no final authority to appeal to, because the system's power lies precisely in this infinite regress. Each level defers to the next, creating a structure that is immune to challenge. There's always a higher authority that cannot be reached, making the entire system self-validating, whilst remaining fundamentally empty. Administrative logic becomes the only acceptable form of reasoning within the system, making individual needs and desires literally unthinkable through bureaucratic categories. When characters attempt to explain personal circumstances, their words are automatically translated into administrative language that fundamentally changes their meaning. In the castle, officials can only understand K's desire to belong in terms of permits, appointments, and jurisdictional questions. His actual human needs become incomprehensible rather than simply ignored. The system lacks the conceptual vocabulary to process authentic human concerns. The bureaucracy doesn't reject individual needs. It makes them impossible to articulate within its framework. The bureaucratic worldview succeeds by making itself appear natural and inevitable, whilst concealing its arbitrary foundations. Characters begin to think in bureaucratic terms, measuring their worth through official recognition and defining their problems in administrative language. Kafka's own experience as an insurance bureaucrat, writing reports that reduced industrial accidents and human suffering to statistical categories, provided him with intimate knowledge of how administrative systems reshape human understanding. Workers' injuries became data points. Human pain transformed into actuarial calculations. This analysis reveals bureaucracy as a form of secular theology that replaces divine authority with administrative procedure. The system possesses all the characteristics of religious authority: infinite hierarchy, mysterious workings, demands for faith, but operates through mundane paperwork rather than sacred ritual. The transcendent has been replaced by the procedural, creating a world where salvation comes through proper documentation rather than spiritual transformation. Yet this replacement maintains the same fundamental structure of unknowable authority demanding absolute submission, suggesting that bureaucracy represents not the secularization of religious authority, but its administrative incarnation. Franz Kafka presents the parable Before the Law as perhaps the most devastating critique of authority ever written. A man from the country approaches the doorkeeper, who guards the entrance to the law, seeking admission. The doorkeeper tells him he cannot enter at this time, but suggests that perhaps later he might be allowed in. The man waits. He waits his entire life, bribing the doorkeeper with everything he possesses, studying every detail of the guardian's appearance, even befriending the fleas in his fur collar. As he lies dying, the doorkeeper reveals that this entrance was made only for him, and now it will be closed forever. This parable exposes the central paradox of modern authority. NBC. The law exists specifically for us as individuals, yet remains perpetually inaccessible through any direct approach. The doorkeeper never actually forbids entry. Instead, he creates the impression that entry is impossible through his warnings about more powerful doorkeepers within, each more terrible than the last. This represents the essential structure of contemporary power. CZ. Authority exercised not through direct prohibition, but through the careful management of hope and fear. The doorkeeper embodies all intermediary authorities that claim to protect what they actually prevent us from reaching. He positions himself as a necessary mediator between the man and the law, suggesting that access requires his permission, while simultaneously indicating that such permission may never come. His final revelation that this entrance was made only for you transforms exclusion into a form of personalized service. The system appears to cater to individual needs, while systematically denying them fulfillment. The man from the country's lifelong wait reveals how authority maintains itself through our own complicity and hope. His waiting becomes a form of worship that sustains the very system that excludes him. Every bribe he offers, every attempt to understand the doorkeeper's character, makes him more deeply invested in the system's legitimacy, even as it denies him access. His hope for eventual admission becomes a mechanism of control rather than liberation. He cannot abandon his quest, because abandoning it would mean acknowledging that his entire life has been meaningless. The priest in the trial offers multiple interpretations of this parable, each contradicting the others. Some readings suggest the doorkeeper deceives the man. Others argue the man deceives himself. Still others claim both are deceived by the nature of the law itself. This interpretive excess mirrors the hermeneutic problems K faces throughout his trial. Meaning is always deferred, never finally fixed. The proliferation of interpretations becomes another form of the law's inaccessibility. Yet Kafka creates profound tension around whether this inaccessibility represents the law's corruption by human institutions or its essential nature as transcendent authority. Perhaps true law exists beyond all its representatives and interpretations, remaining forever uncertain, not because of institutional failure, but because ultimate authority cannot be grasped through human effort. The doorkeeper may be the law's betrayer or its most faithful servant. We cannot know, and this uncertainty becomes the condition under which we must live. Kafka's In the Penal Colony presents us with the most literal representation of how authority inscribes itself upon human existence. The story centers on an elaborate execution machine, an apparatus that kills condemned prisoners by tattooing their sentences directly onto their bodies, with needles that write deeper and deeper until death occurs. The officer who operates this machine explains to a visiting explorer, "The sentence is tattooed on the body of the condemned man by the apparatus. This condemned man, for instance, will have written on his body, 'Honor thy superiors.'" Here we encounter the ultimate bureaucratic fantasy, law that bypasses consciousness entirely and writes itself directly onto the flesh through mechanical precision. The apparatus itself embodies the mechanical nature of modern authority. It consists of three distinct parts: the bed that holds the condemned man motionless, the designer that controls the movement of the needles, and the harrow that performs the actual writing. This mechanical complexity serves a crucial function. It disguises the brutality of the process whilst making it appear scientific and objective. The condemned man is not told his sentence beforehand because, as the officer explains, he'll learn it on his body. This represents authority that operates below the threshold of rational understanding, bypassing the mind to work directly upon physical existence. The machine transforms legal judgment into bodily experience, making the law something that happens to the flesh rather than something comprehended by consciousness. The officer's reverent description of the apparatus reveals how bureaucratic authority becomes detached from any genuine social foundation. He speaks nostalgically of the machine's golden age under the previous commandant, when executions were public ceremonies that created community through shared witnessing of justice. Under the new commandant, however, the executions have lost their audience. Yet the officer continues operating the machine with religious devotion. His technical expertise masks the complete arbitrariness of the sentences. Men are condemned for trivial infractions, and the machine's elaborate ritual cannot disguise that it functions as pure domination dressed up as legal procedure. The officer maintains the apparatus not because it serves justice, but because maintaining it has become his entire identity. The story reaches its climax when the officer subjects himself to the machine, programming it to write, "Be just," on his own body. Yet the apparatus malfunctions catastrophically, stabbing him to death immediately rather than inscribing the sentence gradually through the prescribed 12-hour process. This mechanical failure reveals the self-destructive logic of absolute external authority. Systems based purely on physical domination ultimately consume even their most devoted servants. The machine's breakdown represents the unsustainability of authority that operates through brute force alone. Such systems cannot maintain themselves indefinitely because they produce no genuine consent or understanding, only fear and mechanical compliance. The machine's collapse points toward a deeper question about the nature of modern authority. When bureaucratic systems can no longer maintain themselves through external force, how do they continue to operate? The answer lies in understanding how authority moves from writing on bodies to writing within consciousness itself, creating subjects who carry their own surveillance and judgment internally rather than requiring external mechanical inscription. Part 3. The burden of inexplicable guilt. Kafka's characters inhabit a world where guilt operates as a fundamental structure of consciousness itself, existing prior to any specific transgression or accusation. Josef K. awakens on his 30th birthday to find himself arrested, yet his immediate response reveals something profound about the nature of guilt in Kafka's vision. Rather than protesting his innocence or demanding to know the charges, K. instantly assumes he must have done something wrong. This assumption precedes any evidence, any accusation, any legal framework whatsoever. The guilt exists first, creating the conditions under which accusations become possible rather than arising from them. This psychological reality extends beyond K's particular situation to encompass what Kafka understood as a basic feature of modern consciousness. In his diary, Kafka wrote, "One have often thought that the best mode of life for me would be to sit in the innermost room of a spacious locked cellar with my writing things and a lamp." This reveals not merely a preference for solitude but a fundamental sense of guilt about existing in the world at all, about taking up space, about having needs and desires that might conflict with others. The guilt attaches itself to existence itself rather than to any particular action or omission. This Kafkaesque guilt operates entirely differently from religious concepts of original sin, despite superficial similarities. Religious guilt, even in its most severe forms, provides both a clear narrative of transgression and a path toward redemption. Christianity offers the story of Adam and Eve's disobedience, explaining precisely how guilt entered the world and establishing mechanisms, confession, penance, divine grace, through which it might be addressed. The believer knows what went wrong and possesses, at least in principle, methods for making it right. Kafka's guilt offers no such consolations. It lacks both origin story and redemptive possibility, making it more fundamental and inescapable than traditional religious guilt. K's attempts to confess or repent only entangle him deeper in the legal system without providing the relief that confession typically promises. When he seeks to understand his crime or make amends, the system responds not with forgiveness or even clear condemnation, but with further procedural complications. The guilt becomes self-perpetuating, feeding on attempts to resolve it. This structural guilt serves a crucial psychological function in making individuals complicit in their own oppression through self-condemnation. Characters begin to police themselves more effectively than any external authority could manage, constantly examining their actions and thoughts for evidence of wrongdoing. Gregor Samsa's transformation into an insect represents the most extreme example of this dynamic. Upon discovering his metamorphosis, his immediate concern focuses not on his own well-being or the impossibility of his situation, but on missing work and disappointing his employer. The guilt about failing social obligations becomes more pressing than concern for his own survival, revealing how thoroughly internalized social expectations have become. This internalization creates what might be called a guilt economy, where individuals constantly generate their own sense of inadequacy and wrongdoing. They become their own prosecutors, judges, and executioners, making external control largely unnecessary. The system achieves its most perfect form of power when subjects actively participate in their own subordination, seeking out authorities to validate their sense of guilt rather than resisting imposed judgments. Kafka reveals guilt as the psychological foundation that makes bureaucratic authority possible in the first place. Systems of control depend fundamentally on individuals who already feel guilty and therefore seek judgment and punishment as forms of relief. The bureaucracy in the trial succeeds not through efficient enforcement, but by providing endless opportunities for self-incrimination and self-doubt. Kay's encounters with the court system offer him chances to confess, to explain himself, to seek absolution, all of which only confirm his status as guilty party requiring judgment. The scene where Kay encounters the whipper, punishing the guards who arrested him, illuminates this dynamic perfectly. The punishment serves no clear purpose within any rational system of justice or efficiency. Georg Bendermann stands at the center of an impossible geometry, caught between the competing demands of his aging father and his fiancée Frida. In The Judgment, Kafka presents us with a man who believes he can navigate these relationships through careful balance, maintaining his filial duties whilst building a new life. Georg tends to his father's business, manages the household, and prepares for marriage, convinced that love and responsibility can coexist harmoniously. His letter to his friend in Russia, a simple act of sharing good news, becomes the detonator that explodes this careful construction. The father's explosive condemnation reveals the hidden impossibility of Georg's position. What appeared as loving care is reframed as patronizing control. "So you've been playing around with me," the father declares, exposing Georg's attentiveness as manipulation. Yet independence would equally constitute abandonment. The engagement to Frida represents both natural development and fundamental betrayal. A young man's right to love transformed into evidence of disloyalty. Georg discovers that every choice leads to condemnation because the system itself generates contradictory demands that cannot be simultaneously satisfied. The father's accusations shift and multiply with bewildering speed. Georg is simultaneously too dependent and too independent, too caring and too selfish, too present and too absent. The charges contradict each other precisely because their function is not rational judgment, but total domination. An innocent child. Yes, that you were, truly, but still more truly have you been a devilish human being. The father's verdict makes defense impossible because innocence and guilt are declared simultaneously, creating a double bind that admits no escape. Georg's suicide appears to resolve the dilemma through dramatic action, but it actually represents the complete internalization of external authority. Running to the bridge, he cries, "Dear parents, one have always loved you, all the same," before throwing himself into the river. This apparent resolution masks its own coercive nature. The suicide becomes proof of love, transforming self-destruction into the ultimate expression of filial devotion. The father figure embodies patriarchal authority that reproduces itself through demanding self-elimination from the next generation. His power operates not through physical force, but through psychological mechanisms that make Georg internalize impossible demands. Kafka understood this dynamic intimately, describing in his Letter to his Father how Hermann Kafka created conditions where Franz felt simultaneously guilty for existing and guilty for failing to meet expectations. The son becomes complicit in his own destruction, believing it represents authentic choice rather than systemic coercion. This pattern reveals how authority perpetuates itself across generations by creating subjects who experience their own existence as fundamentally guilty. The father's verdict is always already pronounced, not because of specific transgressions, but because the subject's very being constitutes an offense against the established order. Georg's tragedy lies not in his particular choices, but in his acceptance of a system that demands self-destruction as the price of love, ensuring that patriarchal authority survives through the elimination of those it claims to cherish. Kafka's characters inhabit a world where solitude offers no sanctuary from judgment. Josef K. walks through Prague, convinced that his arrest has rendered him transparent, that strangers can detect his legal predicament through some invisible mark. The trial, he realizes with growing horror, was not just taking place in the courtroom, but everywhere. This isn't paranoia. It's the recognition of a fundamental shift in consciousness, where external surveillance has been internalized so completely that privacy itself becomes impossible. The genius of Kafka's analysis lies in showing how shame operates as social control through mechanisms far more sophisticated than crude external monitoring. His characters cannot escape judgment even in complete solitude because they have absorbed the perspective of their judges so thoroughly that it becomes their own inner voice. Gregor Samsa experiences his transformation not through his own sensations, but through his family's anticipated revulsion. Even alone in his room, he sees himself through their eyes, feeling shame for a condition he never chose and cannot control. This internalized surveillance proves more effective than any external authority because it operates continuously without requiring actual watchers. Kafka's characters rehearse explanations and justifications for audiences that may never materialize, their consciousness shaped entirely by the anticipation of judgment. They lose access to authentic inner experience because every thought and feeling is immediately subjected to imagined evaluation. The very precision of Kafka's legal language suggests someone constantly preparing a defense, translating lived experience into the categories demanded by invisible prosecutors. The psychological architecture Kafka reveals is devastating in its efficiency. Characters become more effective at monitoring themselves than any external authority could be. K experiences the terrible moment of recognition when he realizes he has begun thinking like his prosecutors, evaluating his own actions through their categories and assumptions. He has internalized not just their gaze, but their entire framework for understanding guilt and innocence. This self-surveillance creates subjects who participate willingly in their own psychological oppression. They police themselves according to internalized standards they can never satisfy, constantly finding themselves wanting according to criteria they never consciously accepted. The shame operates through a cruel logic. The more desperately they seek approval from the invisible authority, the more they confirm their fundamental inadequacy. Kafka's revelation cuts to the heart of modern power relations. Authority no longer needs to watch directly when it has successfully created individuals who watch themselves. The most effective control operates through the manipulation of visibility and recognition, creating subjects who experience their own existence as a perpetual audition before judges whose standards remain forever mysterious. This analysis exposes shame not as personal failing, but as a sophisticated mechanism of social control that transforms the very structure of consciousness itself. Part 4. The Castle of Unreachable Goals. The land surveyor K arrives in the village with a letter of appointment, claiming he has been summoned by the castle to perform surveying work. His confidence is absolute. This is simply a matter of presenting his credentials and beginning his duties. The castle looms above the village, appearing close enough to reach on foot. Yet, every path K takes leads away from it. The geography itself seems to conspire against arrival. K's first glimpse reveals the village's true nature. It was only a wretched-looking town, a huddle of village houses, whose sole merit, if any, lay in being built of stone, but the plaster had long since flaked off, and the stones seemed to be crumbling away. This initial confidence that bureaucratic confusion can be resolved through proper channels and direct communication becomes K's first delusion. He believes in the possibility of straightforward resolution. Yet the castle defies normal spatial logic. The castle represents far more than K's professional destination. It embodies all transcendent goals that promise ultimate fulfillment whilst remaining perpetually inaccessible. K's desire encompasses multiple longings simultaneously: professional validation as a surveyor, social belonging within the village community, and metaphysical certainty about his purpose and identity. The castle functions as what Kafka reveals to be an empty signifier, attracting infinite desire precisely because its actual nature remains forever unknown. Villagers speak of the castle with profound reverence, yet none can describe what actually occurs within its walls or identify who makes the decisions that supposedly govern their lives. The castle's power derives from its absence, not its presence. It commands absolute authority whilst remaining completely mysterious. This creates Kafka's central paradox. Every step toward the goal increases the distance from it. K employs various strategies, appealing to officials, seeking local allies, attempting direct approach, CGEM. Yet each effort generates new obstacles and complications rather than progress. His attempts to prove his legitimacy as land surveyor only raise deeper questions about who summoned him and why such summoning occurred. When the castle responds, its communications are invariably ambiguous and contradictory, neither confirming nor denying K's claims, but creating fresh uncertainties that demand further investigation. The bureaucratic apparatus, designed to facilitate access, becomes the primary impediment to reaching one's destination. The village exists entirely in the castle's shadow, yet no inhabitant has actually been there. This creates a community organized around collective relationship to an absent center. Social structure based on shared faith in transcendent authority that may not exist. Villagers derive their identity and social hierarchy from supposed proximity to castle authority, Though this authority remains purely theoretical, the village mayor claims intimate knowledge of castle procedures, whilst admitting he has never set foot within its walls. Characters position themselves as intermediaries between K and the castle, yet their authority stems from the same unknowing relationship to the absent center that defines K's predicament. Kafka reveals how human communities organize themselves around unreachable ideals, creating elaborate systems of meaning and hierarchy based on collective faith rather than direct experience. The castle's authority becomes absolute precisely because it cannot be verified or challenged through encounter. K's impossible mission exposes the fundamental structure of human longing, is we are drawn toward goals that recede as we approach them, creating endless deferral of satisfaction and meaning. The tragedy lies not in failing to reach the castle, but in discovering that the very act of seeking transforms the seeker into someone for whom arrival becomes impossible. The castle presents K with an infinite regression of authority, where each official he encounters claims to possess power while simultaneously deferring to higher levels that remain perpetually beyond reach. When K seeks audience with Clam, the mysterious official who supposedly controls his fate as land surveyor, he discovers that Clam himself answers to superiors whose names are whispered but never confirmed. Sortini, the official who allegedly summoned K to the village, exists as pure absence, referenced constantly but never present, his authority maintained precisely through his inaccessibility. Burgle offers the most tantalizing possibility, a detailed explanation of how applicants might theoretically gain access to officials, but only under conditions so impossibly specific that they serve to highlight the system's fundamental inaccessibility rather than provide genuine opportunity. Each official represents a different aspect of bureaucratic authority's self-perpetuating mystery. Clam embodies power that maintains itself through deliberate obscurity. In Clam, his physical appearance changes depending on who observes him, suggesting that his authority exists not in any concrete form, but in the projections and hopes of those who seek his recognition. Sortini demonstrates how absent authority can be more powerful than present authority. His very invisibility allows others to attribute unlimited power to him without the risk of disappointing concrete encounter. Burgle reveals the system's most sophisticated mechanism, the creation of theoretical accessibility that serves to legitimize practical impossibility. This structure serves a specific psychological function. K's belief that reaching the correct official will resolve his existential situation keeps him perpetually engaged with the castle system. Even as each encounter deepens his frustration, the promise that authority exists somewhere within the hierarchy, D1D, that meaning and belonging await at the proper level, prevents him from questioning the hierarchy itself. Burgle's midnight explanation proves particularly revealing. He describes windows of opportunity so narrow and conditions so precise that they exist more as theoretical possibilities than practical realities. An applicant must arrive at exactly the right moment when an official is overwhelmed by cases, must ask the right questions without knowing what those questions are, and must maintain hope whilst avoiding the desperation that would disqualify their petition. The village community organizes itself around this shared hope for castle recognition, creating social bonds based on collective waiting rather than mutual aid or authentic relationship. Villagers compete for signs of favor, a letter from an official, a summons to an interview, recognition of their service. 7. Whilst remaining equally excluded from actual access to the source of meaning they seek. This competition prevents solidarity amongst those who share the same fundamental exclusion turning potential allies into rivals for scarce symbolic rewards. The transcendent goal maintains its power precisely through perpetual deferral. The castle's authority depends on remaining mysterious and inaccessible. Actual contact might reveal its limitations, its arbitrariness, or its simple humanity. The system succeeds not by delivering what it promises, but by maintaining the promise as a perpetually deferred possibility. Each near miss, each theoretical explanation of how access might be gained, each glimpse of an official, serves to reinforce rather than undermine the system's hold over those who seek its recognition. This reveals the structure of modern secular transcendence, where meaning and belonging are always located just beyond reach, in institutions, achievements, or relationships that promise fulfillment, whilst systematically deferring it. The hierarchy of inaccessibility creates the psychological conditions that make transformation appear both necessary and impossible. Necessary because the current system provides no genuine satisfaction, impossible because the system has structured hope itself as a mechanism of control. Kay's arrival in the village exposes the fundamental paradox of modern community. Belonging is promised, but perpetually withheld through bureaucratic mechanisms that make inclusion conditional on approvals that never materialize. His desire to establish himself as the village land surveyor encounters immediate obstacles that reveal how official recognition precedes and determines all social relationships. The village mayor explains with bureaucratic precision that land surveyors are not needed, but adds the crucial caveat that if one were needed, the process of official appointment would require years of deliberation through castle channels. This creates the perfect trap. Kay cannot belong because he lacks official status. But he cannot obtain official status because the very need for his position remains perpetually under review. Kay's attempts to forge personal connections with villagers like Frida and the assistants demonstrate how even intimate relationships become entangled in questions of official standing. Frida's affection for him is genuine. Yet their relationship remains provisional because her own position depends on castle approval. The assistants, assigned to help him, simultaneously spy on him, embodying the impossibility of authentic relationship within systems where personal connection is mediated by institutional surveillance. Every conversation, every gesture of friendship, carries the implicit question, does this person have the right to be here? Kay's lack of official permission transforms every human interaction into a potential betrayal, not through malice but through the structural requirements of a community organized around exclusion. The village achieves its sense of collective identity precisely through the shared act of excluding Kay. As the unauthorized outsider, villagers bond not through common values or mutual care, but through their collective recognition that Kay lacks proper credentials. This creates a community structure where insiders are defined primarily by their ability to identify and reject outsiders, rather than by any positive shared identity or purpose. Kay's presence threatens village stability, not because he commits harmful acts, but because he reveals the arbitrary nature of their own inclusion. His very existence, as someone seeking belonging, exposes how precarious everyone's position actually is. If Kay can be excluded for lacking proper authorization, what prevents the same exclusion from falling upon any current insider? The villagers' relationships with each other are mediated through their shared relationship to castle authority, rather than direct mutual recognition. They know each other, not as individuals with unique qualities and contributions, but as fellow recipients of castle approval. This creates social bonds that are fundamentally shallow, because they depend on maintaining collective exclusion of those who lack proper credentials. The community's cohesion requires the presence of outsiders to exclude, and others like him. The villagers would have no clear basis for their own belonging. Their inclusion is parasitic on exclusion, creating a social structure that must continuously produce outsiders to maintain insiders' sense of identity. K's quest for belonging reproduces the very system that excludes him. Rather than challenging the principle that community membership should depend on bureaucratic approval, he seeks to obtain that approval for himself. He accepts the premise that belonging requires official recognition and works within the system's logic, hoping to eventually receive the authorization that would transform him from outsider to insider. This reveals how exclusion perpetuates itself. Those seeking inclusion rarely question the legitimacy of exclusion itself, instead working to move themselves from the excluded to the included category, whilst leaving the fundamental structure intact. Yet K occasionally experiences moments of genuine human connection that transcend official categories. These brief encounters, sharing a drink, experiencing kindness from a stranger, moments of mutual recognition, each suggest possibilities for community based on direct human relationship rather than institutional mediation. However, these moments cannot be sustained within the village's structure because institutional categories reassert themselves, transforming every relationship back into questions of authorization and approval. Part 5. Metamorphosis as philosophical method. Kafka's transformations arrive without warning, without explanation, without the courtesy of cause and effect. When Gregor Samsa wakes to find himself changed into a monstrous vermin, the text offers no backstory, no gradual development, no psychological preparation. The metamorphosis simply is, presented with the same matter-of-fact tone one might use to describe the weather. This isn't literary economy, it's philosophical method. Kafka understands that identity itself is far more contingent, far more fragile than we dare acknowledge. The hunger artist's spiritual metamorphosis, the ape's humanization in A Report to an Academy. These changes occur as brute facts rather than results of comprehensible processes. Red Peter doesn't gradually evolve into human form through some Darwinian progression. He simply finds himself capable of human behavior when escape demands it. The hunger artist doesn't slowly develop his extraordinary capacity for fasting through training. He discovers it as an inexplicable gift that separates him from ordinary human appetites. Each transformation reveals how thin the membrane is between what we are and what we might become, how arbitrary our sense of stable selfhood truly is. This arbitrariness cuts deeper than personal identity. Kafka's metamorphoses expose the contingent nature of what we consider normal human existence by making visible the conventions and assumptions that usually remain invisible. Gregor's transformation doesn't create his family's economic dependencies, their social pretensions, their emotional limitations, and Gregor's them. When he can no longer function as breadwinner, the careful architecture of middle-class respectability collapses, exposing the calculations and resentments that were always there beneath the surface of familial affection. His sister Greta's initial compassion, bringing him food and cleaning his room, gives way to resentment as the burden of care becomes inconvenient. "We must try to get rid of it," she finally declares, speaking of her brother as though he were a household pest. The transformation hasn't changed her capacity for love. It has revealed its limits. The family's horror at Gregor's appearance masks their deeper horror at being forced to confront their own emotional poverty, their reduction of human relationships to economic utility. This suggests that normal family life was already monstrous in ways that only become apparent when the facade breaks down. The transformation serves as philosophical tenray, revealing the skeletal structure of relationships that flesh and convention usually conceal. Kafka shows us that the real metamorphosis isn't Gregor's physical change, but the family's gradual abandonment of pretense, their evolution from grief to irritation to active cruelty. Yet transformation in Kafka's world carries no inherent moral charge. It can be curse or liberation, depending entirely on our response to it. Gregor's metamorphosis destroys his social existence while simultaneously freeing him from the demands of work and social performance that were crushing his authentic selfhood. Before his change, he was already trapped by debt, by family obligation, by the grinding routine of commercial travel. The insect body that horrifies others might represent his first honest expression of how the social world had already deformed him. Red Peter's transformation presents the opposite trajectory. Achievement, that is simultaneously betrayal. His acquisition of human behavior allows him to escape the cage, to join human society, to become successful by conventional measures. Yet this success requires the systematic suppression of his ape nature, the careful performance of humanity rather than its authentic expression. He learns to drink, to smoke, to speak, not because these activities fulfill him, but because they provide the key to social acceptance. His transformation is both triumph and tragedy, liberation and imprisonment. The hunger artist's metamorphosis offers a third possibility, the discovery of capacities that separate him from ordinary human appetites and limitations. His extraordinary ability to fast isn't simply a performance trick, but a genuine spiritual achievement, a transcendence of bodily needs that others cannot comprehend. Yet this very transcendence isolates him, makes him incomprehensible to audiences who want spectacle rather than genuine spiritual witness. Perhaps most revealing is how the unchanged world responds to these transformations. Gregor Samsa awakens to discover his transformation into a monstrous insect, and his first response reveals everything about how we understand the relationship between human and animal consciousness. His horror stems not merely from physical discomfort, but from the apparent loss of everything that defines human dignity. The rational mind, social connection, the capacity for meaningful work, all seem threatened by this descent into animal form. His family's disgust mirrors his own, confirming that becoming animal represents the ultimate degradation, a fall from the elevated realm of human consciousness into mere biological existence. This initial revulsion exposes our deepest assumptions about identity. We believe human worth depends on maintaining clear boundaries between rational and instinctual, civilized and natural, meaningful and merely biological. Gregor desperately attempts to preserve his human consciousness despite his transformed body, trying to think through work obligations, family responsibilities, the practical problems of his new condition. His struggle to maintain social connection whilst trapped in an alien form dramatizes the terror that animal transformation represents, not just physical change, but the potential dissolution of everything we consider essentially human. Yet, Kafka's philosophical method demands we examine the reverse transformation, the movement from animal to human consciousness. Red Peter the Ape, addressing an academy of learned humans, reveals a disturbing truth about what becoming human actually requires. One repeat. There was no attraction for me in imitating human beings. One imitated them because one needed a way out, and for no other reason. His education represents not authentic development, but systematic self-betrayal. disguised as progress. Every human skill he acquires, drinking alcohol, smoking pipes, speaking language, distances him further from his essential ape nature. The ape's education becomes a masterclass in sophisticated self-alienation. He learns human behaviors through mechanical imitation and repetition, suppressing his instinctual responses to perform humanity convincingly. His success in human society depends entirely on this performance, on maintaining the illusion that his acquired human characteristics represent genuine development rather than survival strategies. The more successfully he imitates human behavior, the more completely he loses access to his original ape consciousness. This mirrors the process by which humans themselves are socialized into roles that require suppressing authentic nature in favor of socially acceptable performance. Kafka reveals that both transformations, human to animal and animal to human, involve profound loss, but this loss illuminates something crucial about consciousness itself. Gregor's animal transformation, while socially catastrophic, grants him access to forms of perception unavailable to rational consciousness. He develops an appreciation for music that transcends his previous human understanding, perceives his family's true feelings without the mediation of social politeness, experiences reality without the filters of social expectation and rational justification. This suggests that animality represents not merely degradation, but a form of authentic wisdom that rational consciousness obscures. The animal state offers direct experience, unmediated by the complex systems of meaning and social positioning that define human existence. Red Peter's tragedy lies not in his original ape nature, but in his successful abandonment of that nature for human approval. His education represents the systematic destruction of authentic being in favor of social acceptability. The philosophical implications extend beyond individual transformation to question the entire project of civilization. If becoming human requires such complete self-alienation, what does this reveal about human nature itself? Kafka suggests that our rational, civilized consciousness might be built upon the systematic suppression of more authentic ways of being. The animal consciousness we fear and reject might contain forms of truth and wisdom that our sophisticated human development actively destroys. This creates a profound paradox at the heart of human existence. We cannot return to animal consciousness without losing everything we consider valuable about human life. Yet our human consciousness seems to require betraying our essential nature. Kafka's hunger artist represents the ultimate spiritual seeker, one who transforms through systematic self-denial and ascetic practice. This professional faster sits in a cage for 40 days at a time, watched by rotating guards to ensure he doesn't secretly eat, turning the rejection of material sustenance into public performance. Yet his art involves far more than theatrical spectacle. It represents the systematic rejection of physical existence in pursuit of something beyond the material world. When the hunger artist finally confesses, "One have to fast, one can't help it," we discover that his fasting is not chosen discipline, but essential nature, revealing spiritual transformation as the discovery and expression of one's authentic being, rather than self-improvement. The profound tragedy lies in how completely his art is misunderstood. Spectators view his fasting as entertainment or curiosity rather than spiritual practice, missing its deeper significance entirely. They interpret his self-denial through material categories, seeing deprivation where he experiences transcendence. The impresario limits his fasts to 40 days, not for health reasons but because public interest wanes, demonstrating how spiritual seeking becomes commodified and constrained by commercial logic. The hunger artist's deepest frustration stems not from physical deprivation, but from the impossibility of communicating his spiritual insights to those who can only interpret existence in material terms. The public's fascination and eventual boredom reflects society's ambivalent relationship to spiritual seeking. Audiences are initially drawn to the spectacle of extreme self-denial, revealing their unconscious desire for transcendence, yet they lose interest when fasting becomes routine. They want spiritual transformation as entertainment, not as sustained practice requiring genuine attention. The hunger artist's move from prestigious theaters to circuses represents the inevitable degradation of spiritual practice in a society that can only understand it as spectacle. He becomes a sideshow attraction, ignored by crowds more interested in the animals. His spiritual achievement rendered invisible. This invisibility points toward a profound insight about authentic transformation. The hunger artist's spiritual practice requires accepting complete misunderstanding by others, for his achievement exists in a dimension his audience cannot perceive. His final confession, that he fasted because he couldn't find the food one liked, reveals that his spiritual practice was never rejection of the world, but search for authentic nourishment that the world doesn't provide. His death coincides with his greatest spiritual insight, suggesting that genuine transformation may be fundamentally incompatible with social existence. The hunger artist discovers that seeking meaning in a material world creates an impossible paradox. The very act of seeking can become the obstacle to finding, and the deepest spiritual achievements may remain forever unrecognizable to those who have not undertaken the same journey of transformation. Part 6. The Paradox of Seeking. The creature in Kafka's The Burrow has dedicated his entire existence to constructing what he believes to be the perfect defensive system. His underground fortress represents years of meticulous planning and back-breaking labor, designed to protect him from threats he cannot name but feels certain exist. The architecture itself reveals the depth of his paranoia transformed into engineering. Multiple entrances scattered across the forest floor, each carefully concealed and leading through a maze of false passages designed to confuse potential intruders. Storage chambers hold carefully hoarded food supplies, whilst the entire network converges on his castle keep, the innermost sanctuary where he can retreat when all other defenses fail. "One have completed the construction of my burrow, and it seems to be successful," he declares with satisfaction, surveying his life's work with the pride of someone who believes he has solved the fundamental problem of existence: how to remain safe in a dangerous world. Yet this elaborate security system generates precisely the anxieties it was designed to eliminate. Each improvement reveals new vulnerabilities that demand further improvements, creating an endless cycle of defensive enhancement. The multiple entrances that provide escape routes also create multiple points where enemies might penetrate. The food stores that ensure survival require constant maintenance, forcing him to venture above ground where he remains exposed to unknown dangers. His intimate knowledge of every tunnel and chamber makes him acutely aware of every possible failure point: a crack in the wall that might widen, a passage that might collapse, a concealed entrance that might be discovered. The very expertise that enabled him to create his fortress now torments him with awareness of its limitations. He finds himself obsessively checking and rechecking his defenses, patrolling tunnels he has already inspected countless times, searching for signs of intrusion or deterioration that his hypervigilant mind insists must exist somewhere in the system. This defensive hypervigilance transforms reasonable caution into its pathological opposite. His attempts to make the burrow more secure require increasingly frequent trips above ground to gather materials and survey potential threats. exposing him to the very dangers his underground retreat was meant to avoid. Each modification creates noise and disturbance that might attract the attention of enemies he has never seen but feels certain are watching. He becomes obsessed with mysterious sounds, scratchings, rustlings, movements that might indicate intruders penetrating his defenses, or worse still, some great beast burrowing toward his sanctuary from below. His expertise in defense makes him increasingly capable of imagining threats that may exist only in his mind. Yet his knowledge of what is possible makes these imagined threats feel utterly real. The burrow that was meant to provide peace becomes a source of constant anxiety, each moment of security immediately undermined by awareness of new vulnerabilities his improvements have created. The seeking of absolute safety has become indistinguishable from paranoia, revealing how excessive caution can generate the very insecurity it attempts to prevent. His isolation, intended to protect him from external threats, actually increases his vulnerability by cutting him off from accurate information about conditions above ground. Without contact with the outside world, every sound becomes potentially threatening, every silence potentially ominous. The burrow that was meant to solve the problem of security has become the primary source of his insecurity, creating a feedback loop where defensive measures generate the anxiety they were designed to eliminate. This represents the deeper paradox that haunts all human seeking. The very intensity of our search for what we need can become the obstacle that prevents us from finding it, transforming reasonable desire into its own form of imprisonment. In Kafka's haunting tale, the hunter Gracchus presents us with perhaps the most profound image of modern spiritual displacement. Gracchus died in a hunting accident, falling from a precipice in the Black Forest, but his death ship took a wrong turn, leaving him suspended eternally between life and death. When he encounters the burgomaster, Gracchus explains his predicament with devastating clarity. One am here. More than that one do not know. Further than that one cannot go. My ship has no rudder, and it is driven by the wind that blows in the undermost regions of death. This image captures the essence of modern existence, caught between meaning systems, unable to fully inhabit any of them. Gracchus retains consciousness and memory, but lacks the capacity for action or change that defines living existence. He can observe, remember, and suffer, but he cannot participate in life's essential processes of growth, decision, and transformation. Simultaneously, he cannot access whatever peace or resolution death might offer. He remains trapped in a liminal state that provides neither life's possibilities nor death's release. His endless journey takes him through earthly waters, visiting every country but belonging to none, experiencing connection without ever achieving belonging. This suspension between states reveals the modern predicament of those who have lost traditional meaning systems but found no adequate replacement. Gracchus represents individuals who can neither return to older forms of faith and community nor successfully embrace purely secular existence. They remain conscious of what they have lost, whilst unable to fully commit to what modernity offers. The hunter's eternal wandering becomes a metaphor for the spiritual homelessness that characterizes contemporary life. What makes Gracchus's situation particularly devastating is its bureaucratic origin. His predicament results not from moral failing or metaphysical necessity, but from what appears to be a simple navigational mistake. I-19. The death ship's pilot took a wrong turn. This bureaucratization of cosmic processes reflects Kafka's vision of a universe where even ultimate realities operate according to administrative logic that can malfunction. Transcendence itself becomes unreliable, subject to the same arbitrary failures that characterize earthly institutions. The boatman's error suggests that the systems we depend upon for ultimate meaning, religious, philosophical, or cultural, even death, traditionally conceived as the final resolution of life's struggles, becomes another administrative process prone to malfunction. This transforms the sacred into the procedural, making even our deepest spiritual needs dependent upon systems that may simply fail to deliver. Gracchus's consciousness of his condition transforms eternal seeking into eternal punishment. He knows he is trapped, but cannot change his situation through will or effort. His encounters with the living world provide temporary connection, but no lasting resolution, as he must always return to his wandering ship. The very awareness that makes him human also makes his suffering more acute. He understands his predicament without being able to resolve it. This represents the condition of those who seek ultimate meaning or transcendence, but find themselves trapped in the very process of seeking. They cannot stop searching, but equally cannot find what they seek. The search itself becomes a form of imprisonment, creating a cycle where the desire for resolution perpetuates the very displacement it seeks to overcome. Gracchus embodies this impossible situation, forever conscious, forever seeking, forever suspended between the life he cannot fully live and the death he cannot finally die. A country doctor receives an urgent call on a winter night. A patient lies gravely ill, and the community expects healing. Yet from the moment he examines the wound, the doctor recognizes a terrible truth. He lacks both the tools and knowledge required for this task. The journey to reach the patient becomes surreal. Supernatural horses carry him through a snowstorm into a realm where ordinary medical knowledge proves utterly inadequate. Upon examining the patient, he makes a devastating admission. A fine wound is all one brought into the world. That was my sole endowment. The doctor realizes he cannot provide the healing that everyone expects of him. This recognition creates an impossible performance of competence that masks essential helplessness. The doctor must maintain professional authority whilst knowing he cannot deliver what his role promises. The family and community expect miraculous healing based purely on his social position as doctor, but his actual medical knowledge is insufficient for the patient's condition. He finds himself forced into elaborate performances of medical expertise that serve to maintain social confidence rather than provide actual healing. The white coat and medical instruments become props in a theater of false competence. The wound that cannot be healed represents something far deeper than a medical condition. It may represent existence itself, the fundamental damage of being human that no professional expertise can address. The patient's wound functions as both literal medical crisis and metaphysical problem that exceeds the boundaries of any technical intervention. The doctor's recognition of his limitations reveals that the deepest human suffering cannot be cured through professional knowledge, but requires forms of understanding and acceptance that transcend what any social role can provide. The community's desperate demand that he heal what cannot be healed represents society's broader expectation that professional expertise can solve existential problems. What emerges is the recognition that professional roles become elaborate forms of theater, masking our essential helplessness before life's fundamental demands. The doctor's social position requires him to claim knowledge and power he simply does not possess, creating a performance that serves social stability rather than individual healing. His final escape from this impossible situation leaves both him and his patients worse off, suggesting that the very structure of professional helping relationships may be based on false promises that prevent genuine human connection. This represents the broader problem of how social roles require us to claim capacities we fundamentally lack. Creating systems of mutual deception, we maintain these performances because they provide the illusion of control and competence. Yet they prevent authentic recognition of our shared human limitations. The country doctor's impossible mission reveals how professional categories and social expectations can trap us in performances that deny the very forms of meaning and acceptance that might actually address our deepest wounds, wounds that may not require healing so much as honest acknowledgement of what it means to be human in a world that exceeds our capacity to master or repair. Part 7. The Question of God. Franz Kafka inhabited a theological landscape where divine presence neither blazes forth in revelation nor retreats into comfortable atheism, but perpetually hovers at the edges of experience, always deferred, always, just beyond the next administrative procedure. His God exists in a state of radical ambiguity that mirrors the bureaucratic systems his characters navigate. God, neither clearly present nor definitively absent, but caught in an eternal administrative delay that transforms religious seeking into something far more unsettling than either faith or disbelief. The castle stands as Kafka's most sustained exploration of this theological deferral. Kay's arrival in the village represents a fundamentally religious quest. He seeks recognition, belonging, and legitimate place within a cosmic order. Yet, every attempt to reach the castle, that distant authority which may or may not govern the village's reality, leads him deeper into administrative entanglements. The castle's authority operates through endless intermediaries, ECS, secretaries, assistants, messengers, each claiming to represent higher powers whilst simultaneously obscuring access to them. This bureaucratic theology suggests that divine authority, if it exists, has become so mediated through human institutions that it remains perpetually inaccessible to direct encounter. The trial presents an even more disturbing vision of this theological predicament. Josef K's court operates in spaces that grotesquely parody religious architecture. Legal proceedings conducted in tenement attics, judges who resemble priests, and a legal system that claims absolute authority, whilst remaining utterly incomprehensible to those it judges. The court's procedures mirror theological disputations, complete with endless commentaries, interpretations, and scholarly debates about laws that may not exist in any accessible form. Josef K. seeks divine justice, but encounters only human systems, claiming divine authority whilst operating according to purely administrative logic. Kafka's own relationship with divine authority reveals this same theological complexity. In his diary he wrote, "God does not want me to write, but one must." This confession captures the essential paradox of his religious position. He experiences divine prohibition and divine calling simultaneously, creating a creative tension that neither traditional faith nor secular humanism can resolve. His writing becomes an act of simultaneous obedience and rebellion, suggesting that authentic spiritual experience might require defying the very divine authority one seeks to serve. This theological ambiguity extends beyond personal confession into systematic critique of how human institutions corrupt divine reality. Religious seeking consistently leads Kafka's characters into bureaucratic entanglements rather than spiritual fulfillment. K's longing for belonging transforms into administrative procedures that distance him from his original spiritual quest. The very act of seeking divine recognition through established channels corrupts the seeking itself, creating systems that serve their own perpetuation rather than divine purposes. The priest's parable before the law crystallizes this theological predicament. The law exists, the doorkeeper guards it, the man from the country seeks access to it. Yet the parable's final revelation suggests that this particular door was meant only for this particular seeker, who dies without ever gaining entry. The parable operates as theological allegory, suggesting that divine law exists beyond all its human interpreters and guardians, yet remains accessible only through encounters that transcend institutional mediation. Every attempt to systematize access to divine truth creates new barriers to that very truth. This absent God creates a peculiar form of spiritual freedom. Kafka's characters experience divine absence as both liberation from external authority and terror at having no ultimate foundation for meaning or morality. Without clear divine guidance, they must navigate moral and existential questions through their own resources, yet without transcendent oppression, they retain the possibility of authentic spiritual experience beyond institutional control. The absence becomes a space of radical possibility, where everyday bureaucratic encounters might contain hidden mystical dimensions. Kafka's Jewish background intensifies this theological complexity. Kafka transforms the most mundane bureaucratic encounters into mystical confrontations with the incomprehensible. When Joseph K. receives his summons, when the land surveyor, K., arrives at the village, when countless supplicants wait in courthouse corridors, they are not merely navigating administrative procedures, HU, they are entering sacred space. Kafka drew deeply from Jewish mystical traditions, particularly Kabbalah, which teaches that divine sparks lie hidden within ordinary reality, waiting to be recognized and released. Every waiting room becomes a space of spiritual trial. Every official document demands the interpretive intensity traditionally reserved for sacred texts. Every bureaucratic procedure takes on the weight and mystery of ritual practice. This transformation reveals that administrative interactions are theological problems in disguise. Joseph K.'s trial never concerns any specific crime because it addresses his entire existence, his fundamental relationship to authority, meaning, and his place in the cosmic order. The court officials who remain invisible, the judges who never appear, the laws that cannot be accessed directly. These are not merely bureaucratic failures, but manifestations of divine hiddenness. Similarly, K's quest for official recognition from the castle becomes a search for divine acknowledgement, for confirmation that he belongs somewhere in the universe. The castle's endless deferrals and administrative complications mirror the traditional mystical experience of seeking God through a cloud of unknowing. Bureaucratic language itself takes on the opacity and interpretive complexity of sacred texts. The priest tells Joseph K. that the court wants nothing from you. It receives you when you come and dismisses you when you go. This is not administrative indifference, but theological precision. Divine authority operates beyond human categories of want and need. The endless files, the incomprehensible procedures, the officials who speak in riddles, all require hermeneutic effort that resembles Talmudic commentary or Kabbalistic interpretation. Characters must learn to read administrative signs as if they contained hidden divine messages, searching for meaning in delays, contradictions, and apparent meaninglessness. Yet, the sacred remains largely inaccessible to direct approach. Kafka suggests that transcendent meaning might indeed be concealed within mundane procedures, but it cannot be grasped through conventional, religious, or rational methods. This creates a form of negative theology, where God is known only through absence, deferral, and the systematic failure of human institutions to provide ultimate satisfaction. The door that exists only for the man from the country, the castle that can never be reached, the trial that proceeds without evidence. These point toward divine reality, precisely through their refusal to yield to human understanding. Interpretation becomes both absolutely necessary and potentially blasphemous. Characters cannot avoid seeking meaning in their predicaments. Yet every interpretive effort may be either spiritual practice or dangerous self-deception. The priest warns Joseph K. about the perils of interpretation, suggesting that the search for hidden meaning might itself be a form of spiritual pride. This creates Kafka's central paradox. Authentic spiritual seeking requires interpretive effort that may be the very obstacle to religious experience. We must read the signs, whilst recognizing that reading itself might be the trap. Prayer and writing emerge as alternative approaches, NSE, not interpretation, but direct address to the mystery that remains forever beyond comprehension, yet intimately present in every bureaucratic encounter. Kafka's spiritual crisis reveals itself most starkly in his diary entries, where intense religious longing collides with theological doubt. What have one in common with Jews? One have hardly anything in common with myself, and should stand very quietly in a corner, content that one can breathe. This confession exposes the profound alienation that drives his entire literary project. A man cut off, not only from his religious tradition, but from his own identity, yet unable to abandon the spiritual questions that torment him. His attendance at Yiddish theater performances and his late study of Hebrew represent desperate attempts to reconnect with Jewish spiritual tradition whilst maintaining critical distance from organized religion. These efforts failed to restore faith, but deepened his understanding of what had been lost in modernity's spiritual wasteland. The failure of traditional religious frameworks to provide certainty did not diminish Kafka's spiritual hunger. Instead, it transformed his writing into a form of secular spiritual discipline that operates outside institutional religion whilst maintaining religious intensity. Writing is a form of prayer, he declared, yet this prayer operates without confidence in any divine recipient. His stories become meditations on ultimate questions, meaning, guilt, transcendence, that preserve the urgency of religious inquiry whilst questioning religious answers. This literary prayer emerges from spiritual crisis rather than spiritual comfort, creating a new form of religious practice for an age when God's existence has become uncertain, but God's absence remains unbearable. Writing as prayer transforms both activities. Prayer becomes a form of writing, a careful attention to language, metaphor, and meaning that seeks to articulate the inexpressible. Writing becomes a form of prayer, a wrestling with ultimate questions that demands complete honesty and spiritual vulnerability. This fusion creates neither traditional literature nor traditional spirituality, but something unprecedented. A spiritual practice that maintains religious seriousness whilst abandoning religious certainty. Kafka's stories function as prayers offered to an unknown God, maintaining the structure and intensity of religious devotion, whilst acknowledging that the divine recipient may not exist. Grace, if it exists in Kafka's universe, operates according to logic, incomprehensible to rational consciousness. It cannot be earned through spiritual practice or moral behavior, but arrives as pure gift in moments of recognition that transcend rational understanding. Gregor Samsa experiences such grace in his final moments, achieving peace that exceeds his circumstances or deserving. The hunger artist receives spiritual insight that validates his entire life's work, precisely when that work appears most meaningless. These moments of grace cannot be achieved through will or effort, but arrive as surprises that exceed the character's expectations, revealing meaning where none seemed possible. The possibility of redemption remains perpetually open in Kafka's theological vision, but it cannot be grasped through human effort or systematic spiritual practice. Instead, it requires a form of spiritual receptivity that abandons the attempt to control transcendent experience. This receptivity involves maintaining openness to grace whilst accepting that it may never arrive in recognizable form. Kafka's late story, Josephine the Singer, potentially represents this relationship to divine inspiration. Josephine's singing may be nothing special, indistinguishable from ordinary mouse squeaking, yet it creates community and meaning for her people. The gift may be ordinary, even illusory, but its effects transcend its material reality. This theological position transforms anxiety from mere psychological suffering into potential spiritual knowledge. The uncertainty that torments Kafka's characters becomes the very condition that makes grace possible. Absolute knowledge would eliminate the need for faith. Absolute despair would eliminate the possibility of hope. Kafka's characters inhabit the space between these extremes, where spiritual truth remains possible but never guaranteed, where prayer continues despite the silence of heaven. Part 8. The Architecture of Anxiety. Kafkaesque anxiety operates without specific focus, making it impossible to address through rational action or problem-solving strategies. Joseph K. experiences pervasive dread that cannot be traced to any particular threat. He knows he has done nothing wrong, yet feels constantly endangered by forces he cannot identify or locate. This differs fundamentally from fear, which has specific objects and can be addressed through avoidance or confrontation. K. realizes it's only a trial if one recognizes it as such, revealing how anxiety creates its own reality, independent of external circumstances. The dread exists prior to any concrete justification, establishing itself as a basic condition of consciousness rather than a response to identifiable danger. This free-floating dread reveals the groundlessness of modern existence, where traditional sources of meaning and security have been undermined without replacement. Characters experience anxiety as knowledge about their fundamental situation rather than pathological symptom requiring cure. Kafka's own letters describe feeling constantly threatened by unnamed dangers that emerge from existence itself, not from specific circumstances, but from the very structure of being alive in modernity. The anxiety reflects accurate perception of modern life's instability rather than psychological distortion. Traditional anchors of identity, family, profession, community, religious faith, no longer provide reliable foundation, leaving individuals suspended in uncertainty that manifests as persistent unease. Anxiety becomes a form of knowledge about the human condition, providing insight into realities that rational consciousness prefers to ignore. Characters' anxiety often proves prophetic, truth. Their dread anticipates real dangers and reveals hidden truths about situations that optimistic rationality misses. Gregor's pre-transformation anxiety about his job and family responsibilities accurately reflects the precariousness of his position, which becomes visible only after his metamorphosis. His nervous concern about missing work and disappointing his supervisor anticipates the complete collapse of his social identity. The anxiety reveals arbitrary nature of social arrangements that present themselves as stable and necessary, exposing how quickly supposedly secure positions can dissolve. The attempt to escape anxiety through security measures only intensifies it, creating feedback loops where defensive strategies generate new sources of dread. The creature in the burrow constructs elaborate security systems that become the primary source of his anxiety, showing how attempts to eliminate uncertainty create new forms of uncertainty. Each defensive measure introduces fresh vulnerabilities. Each precaution reveals previously unconsidered dangers. Characters who try to resolve anxiety through bureaucratic procedures find themselves more deeply entangled in systems that increase rather than reduce fundamental insecurity. The very act of seeking official resolution confirms the validity of the initial anxiety whilst creating additional grounds for concern. This reveals anxiety as potentially valuable information about existence that should be understood rather than simply eliminated. The discomfort signals recognition of genuine instabilities and contradictions within supposedly rational social arrangements. Rather than indicating personal inadequacy, anxiety demonstrates accurate perception of conditions that others successfully ignore through distraction or denial. The anxious individual perceives fractures in the social fabric that optimistic consciousness overlooks, making anxiety a form of unwelcome but essential knowledge about the true nature of modern life. Kafka reveals how ordinary social interactions can suddenly take on the logic of nightmares when familiar situations become governed by hidden or contradictory rules we cannot access. Josef K's arrest scene demonstrates this transformation perfectly. His landlady's breakfast room becomes a courtroom without warning, transforming familiar domestic space into a site of judgment and interrogation. The guards who arrest him eat his breakfast while explaining legal procedures that remain incomprehensible to him, showing how bureaucratic authority appropriates personal resources whilst claiming to serve justice. Normal domestic space is invaded by court officials who operate according to their own mysterious protocols, making the familiar suddenly alien and threatening. This nightmare logic emerges when social systems operate according to hidden or contradictory rules that participants cannot access or understand. K's attempts to behave reasonably and rationally only entangle him deeper in procedures that follow their own internal logic, rather than common sense or justice. He discovers that court sessions happen in tenement attics at unpredictable times, making participation impossible for anyone with normal work obligations. The system's rules are simultaneously rigid and arbitrary, creating double binds where any response can be interpreted as evidence of guilt or non-cooperation. K cannot win because the game's rules are designed to be unknowable whilst remaining absolutely binding. The familiar becomes uncanny when examined closely, revealing arbitrary and unstable foundations beneath apparently solid social arrangements. K's bank work, initially presented as normal professional activity, becomes increasingly surreal as his trial progresses and he realizes his colleagues may be involved in his prosecution. Gregor's family relationships, which seemed stable before his transformation, reveal themselves as purely economic arrangements that collapse when he can no longer fulfill his breadwinner role. Characters discover that people they trusted are connected to the systems that oppress them in ways they never suspected, making every relationship potentially duplicitous. Kafka suggests that sanity requires a certain blindness to the absurdity of normal life, where awareness threatens psychological survival by making visible the arbitrariness and violence underlying social order. Characters who begin to see clearly how their social systems actually operate find themselves unable to participate normally in daily life. This creates the paradox that mental health depends on not thinking too carefully about the nature of the institutions and relationships that structure our existence. What we call normal life is actually a collective agreement to ignore the nightmare logic that governs social reality, a willful blindness that protects us from recognizing how precarious and arbitrary our social world truly is. Kafka's characters inhabit a peculiar temporal dimension, where waiting becomes the primary mode of existence. The man from the country in Before the Law spends his entire life before a door, waiting for permission to enter, that never comes. K organizes his days around anticipated appointments with castle officials who remain perpetually unavailable. This is not passive waiting. It requires constant vigilance, endless preparation for opportunities that exist only as possibilities. Characters structure their entire lives around anticipated events that may never materialize, transforming time from a medium of possibility into a source of anxiety and paralysis. This waiting reveals a fundamental temporal conflict at the heart of modern existence. Personal urgency collides with bureaucratic indifference to individual temporal experience. Kay's desperate need for resolution meets the castle's timeless administrative procedures that operate according to their own schedule rather than human need. Joseph K. discovers his trial operates on a temporal logic completely disconnected from his personal life. Court sessions happen when convenient for officials, not when needed by defendants. This temporal mismatch creates a form of torture where urgent personal needs are subjected to institutional rhythms that ignore human temporality entirely. The future, traditionally a realm of hope and possibility, becomes a source of dread. Josef K's trial makes every future moment, potentially the moment of final judgment, transforming anticipation into anxiety. Gregor's family waits for his death as the solution to their problems, making his future a source of dread for everyone involved. The Hunger Artist's audiences lose interest over time, showing how even positive attention cannot be sustained, making the future a realm of inevitable disappointment rather than potential fulfillment. This anxiety about what is to come hollows out present experience entirely. Characters cannot inhabit their current reality fully because anticipation of future events makes present experience feel provisional and unreal. They cannot commit to current relationships or activities because everything might change when the awaited event finally occurs. This creates a temporal prison where neither past, present, nor future provides solid ground for experience. Kafka reveals how modern consciousness becomes trapped in temporal anxiety, where meaning is always located in future achievements or resolutions rather than present experience. This psychological condition prepares us to examine how responsibility and ethics function when agency itself becomes questionable. Part 9. The Ethics of Impossibility. Kafka's characters discover themselves trapped within an ethical paradox that strikes at the heart of modern existence. They feel profoundly responsible for situations entirely beyond their control. Joseph K. experiences mounting guilt, despite knowing he has committed no identifiable crime, whilst Gregor Samsa shoulders responsibility for his family's financial difficulties. Even though his transformation was involuntary and utterly unpredictable, this disconnect between responsibility and agency creates a moral landscape where traditional ethics collapse into absurdity. The paradox deepens when we examine Kafka's own relationship to responsibility. In his diary, he writes with characteristic precision, "One am responsible for the disturbance. One cause by my mere existence." Here, existence itself becomes a source of ethical burden, independent of any particular action or choice. The very fact of being becomes grounds for guilt, suggesting that responsibility has become detached from causation, choice, or rational moral calculation. This ethical impossibility reflects the broader condition of individuals within modern bureaucratic systems. These systems assign responsibility to people, whilst simultaneously demonstrating that individual action cannot meaningfully influence outcomes. Joseph K. finds himself held accountable for crimes he cannot identify, committed through processes he cannot understand, within a legal system he cannot influence through rational action or moral appeal. The court demands his responsibility, whilst denying him any genuine agency to exercise that responsibility meaningfully. Such systems create ethical double-binds, where characters are condemned for acting and condemned for not acting, with no possibility of ethical clarity or resolution. The country doctor feels morally obligated to heal patients he cannot help, using tools that don't work, within a system that makes genuine care impossible. Yet abandoning his sense of responsibility would represent a different kind of moral failure. He remains trapped between ineffective action and morally unacceptable indifference. This creates a form of moral suffering that cannot be resolved through better choices, clearer ethical thinking. Characters continue to experience guilt, compassion, and moral obligation, even when they recognize that their actions cannot achieve ethical goals. Unlike traditional ethical systems that assume moral feelings guide effective moral action, Kafka presents situations where moral sensitivity becomes a source of perpetual anguish rather than practical guidance. The impossibility of ethical action does not eliminate the inescapability of ethical feeling. Characters cannot simply abandon their moral responses through rational analysis or philosophical detachment. Gregor continues to worry about his family's welfare even after his transformation makes him a burden rather than a provider. His moral feelings persist despite becoming practically counterproductive, creating ongoing suffering that serves no instrumental purpose. Yet within this apparent hopelessness, Kafka suggests a different approach to responsibility. Rather than focusing on how we change our situation, responsibility might concern how we bear our situation. Characters who accept their powerlessness whilst maintaining their moral sensitivity achieve a form of ethical authenticity unavailable to those who either deny their powerlessness or abandon their moral feelings entirely. This creates an ethics of endurance rather than action, witness rather than intervention. The responsibility lies not in solving problems or preventing suffering, but in maintaining recognition of moral reality even when that reality cannot be practically addressed. Such responsibility requires neither agency nor effectiveness, but demands a form of moral courage that persists without hope of resolution. This understanding of responsibility prepares us to examine how even our attempts to help others become entangled in the systems of control that create the need for help in the first place. Kafka's characters repeatedly attempt to help others with genuine, compassionate intentions, yet these interventions inevitably become entangled in bureaucratic and psychological complexities that negate the very help they offer. The country doctor embarks on his nighttime journey, driven by professional duty and human compassion. A man called to heal the sick cannot refuse such a summons. His mission begins with the clearest moral imperative. Someone suffers, and he possesses the knowledge to alleviate that suffering. Similarly, Grete's initial response to her brother's transformation flows from natural sisterly affection. She brings him food, cleans his room, and protects him from their parents' revulsion. Her care emerges from love, from the recognition that Gregor remains her brother despite his monstrous form. These helping relationships begin with moral clarity that gradually dissolves into ambiguity. The country doctor's compassionate response to the emergency call sets in motion events that spiral beyond his control or intention. Grete's loving care for Gregor starts as an expression of family loyalty, but slowly transforms into something more complex and troubling. What appears initially as straightforward ethical action, helping those who suffer, reveals layers of complication that transform the nature of the help itself. The interventions consistently worsen situations or expose hidden complications that convert assistance into harm. The country doctor's arrival creates chaos rather than healing. His supernatural horses destroy the patient's property. His presence exposes dysfunctional family dynamics, and his medical examination proves inadequate whilst raising expectations he cannot fulfill. The very act of responding to the call for help generates new forms of suffering. Grete's care for Gregor enables the family's denial about their desperate economic situation. Her assumption of responsibility for her brother allows their parents to avoid confronting the reality of their circumstances, creating new dependencies whilst the family's resources dwindle. Her compassionate intervention becomes a mechanism that perpetuates the crisis rather than resolving it. These patterns suggest that good intentions become inevitably entangled in bureaucratic and psychological complexities beyond individual control. Helping relationships become structured by the same power dynamics and institutional logic that created the original problems. The advocate in The Trial exemplifies this pattern perfectly. He claims to help Joseph K. navigate the incomprehensible legal system. Yet his assistance makes K's situation more complex and hopeless. The advocate's help serves his own professional interests, maintaining his position within the very system that oppresses his client. His knowledge of the court's procedures becomes a form of power over K, creating dependency rather than liberation. The helper and helped become locked in relationships that serve neither party's authentic interests, but perpetuate themselves through mutual dependency and guilt. Grete's identity becomes increasingly defined by her role as Gregor's caretaker, even as this role grows burdensome and resentful. She cannot abandon her brother without seeming cruel, yet continuing her care corrupts her natural affection into duty and eventually into hatred. The relationship serves neither Grete's development nor Gregor's well-being, yet its very existence creates moral obligations that trap both parties. This analysis reveals how the desire to do good may mask unconscious forms of self-interest or will to power over others, making ethical action inherently suspect. Characters who position themselves as helpers often derive identity, purpose, or social status from their helping role, creating investment in maintaining the problems they claim to solve. The country doctor's professional identity depends on being needed. The advocate's authority rests on the court's continued opacity. Grete's sense of moral superiority requires Gregor's continued dependency. These helpers become invested in the perpetuation of the very conditions that necessitate their help. The ethical relationships that emerge are based on inequality and dependency, rather than mutual recognition and respect. The helper assumes a position of knowledge, capability, or moral authority over the helped, creating hierarchies that undermine the possibility of genuine compassion. Kafka reveals compassion as a form of violence that operates through care itself. In the Metamorphosis, Grete's devotion to her transformed brother becomes a mechanism of control, more total than any direct domination. She determines what Gregor needs, when he needs it, how he should receive it, all whilst positioning herself as his loving protector. Her compassion transforms him from subject into object of care, eliminating his agency under the guise of meeting his needs. This caring violence proves more insidious than open cruelty, because it cannot be resisted without appearing ungrateful. Greta's management of Gregor's condition serves her psychological requirements, MN, the need to be needed, the satisfaction of moral superiority, the family status that comes from being indispensable. Her identity becomes dependent upon his dependency. She unconsciously invests in maintaining his helpless condition because his recovery would eliminate her purpose and significance. Gregor becomes complicit in this dynamic, trading autonomy for security and family connection. He accepts her determinations about his needs rather than asserting his own desires or experiences. This complicity creates a self-perpetuating system where helper and helped become locked in roles that serve neither party's authentic interests. The helping relationship resists resolution because resolution would destroy the relationship itself. Kafka suggests that genuine compassion may require accepting our fundamental inability to save others. The most compassionate characters in his work often provide presence rather than intervention, witnessing suffering without attempting to eliminate it. They offer recognition and acknowledgement rather than solutions or management. This form of compassion demands abandoning the helper role that provides identity and meaning, accepting our powerlessness to rescue others from their predicament. Such compassion becomes a form of bearing witness rather than taking action. It creates solidarity based on shared recognition of human limitation rather than rescue fantasies. Characters who abandon attempts to help or be helped sometimes achieve more authentic connection through mutual acknowledgement of their common condition. This generates ethics based on presence and truthful recognition, rather than change and intervention. This witness-based compassion establishes the foundation for examining whether genuine liberation remains possible from the conditions Kafka describes, or whether honest recognition of our predicament constitutes the only available form of freedom. Part 10. The Possibility of Escape. Kafka's parable, The Great Wall of China, presents us with one of his most penetrating examinations of how systems of control might contain the very mechanisms of their own undoing. The story describes a massive construction project intended to protect the Chinese Empire from northern barbarians, but Kafka reveals that this wall contains gaps and inconsistencies that fundamentally undermine its defensive purpose. The wall is built in sections by different work crews who complete their portions and move on, leaving spaces between sections that are never filled. Workers are told this piecemeal method is more efficient, but the narrator suspects the gaps are intentional, serving purposes unknown to the builders themselves. The narrator observes with growing unease. The wall was meant to be a protection for centuries. Accordingly, the most scrupulous care in the building, the application of the architectural wisdom of all known ages and peoples, the constant sense of personal responsibility in the builders were indispensable prerequisites for the work. Yet, despite this proclaimed dedication to permanence and protection, the construction method ensures that the wall will never actually protect anything. The gaps remain, creating entry points that render the entire project strategically meaningless. This architectural absurdity forces us to confront a crucial ambiguity about whether systemic inconsistencies offer genuine liberation or simply represent different forms of control. The gaps in the wall could allow barbarian invasion, making the entire project pointless. But they could equally provide escape routes for those trapped within the Empire's control. The narrator cannot determine whether these gaps result from incompetence, sabotage, or deliberate design by authorities who understand purposes beyond the worker's comprehension. This uncertainty reflects the broader problem of interpreting systemic failures. Do they represent opportunities for resistance, or more sophisticated forms of control that operate through apparent dysfunction? The wall's purpose remains unclear even to its builders, suggesting the profound arbitrariness of grand projects that claim to serve essential functions. Workers are told they are protecting civilization from barbarian invasion, but they never see the barbarians and cannot verify the threat's reality. The narrator's research into historical records provides only contradictory accounts of the wall's necessity and effectiveness. This represents the modern condition of participating in vast institutional projects whose ultimate purposes remain mysterious to those who carry them out. We build systems we cannot understand, serving functions we cannot evaluate, trapped within projects whose logic escapes us entirely. Yet Kafka suggests that hope lies not in completing the system but in recognizing its fundamental incompleteness. The narrator's investigation into the wall's construction leads him to question not just the building methods, but the entire imperial system that commands such projects. His growing awareness of the wall's contradictions creates a form of intellectual freedom, even though it doesn't change his material circumstances. The gaps in the wall become metaphors for gaps in understanding that might allow new forms of consciousness to emerge. This recognition of systemic incompleteness creates the foundation for a different relationship to power and meaning. Rather than seeking to escape the system entirely, an impossibility that Kafka consistently rejects, we might learn to inhabit its contradictions consciously. The narrator's investigation doesn't free him from the empire, but it frees him from the illusion that the empire's projects make coherent sense. This shift in consciousness, whilst not providing material liberation, creates space for authentic existence within inauthentic systems. The wall's gaps thus represent more than architectural failure. Beyond life, they represent the inevitable spaces where human consciousness might assert itself against the totality of systematic control. These spaces don't offer escape in any simple sense, but they offer something potentially more valuable: the possibility of understanding one's situation clearly enough to live authentically within it. Josephine stands before her people, a mouse amongst mice, her voice rising in what she claims is song. The mouse community gathers in concentric circles around her frail form, listening with an attention that borders on reverence. Yet the narrator observes something peculiar about these performances. Is it her singing that enchants us, or is it not rather the solemn stillness enclosing her frail little voice? The question cuts to the heart of artistic meaning itself. Josephine's piping may be indistinguishable from the ordinary sounds any mouse makes, but her performances create something extraordinary. Moments of collective significance that transform her audience from scattered individuals into a unified community. The mouse people cannot identify what makes Josephine's singing superior to their own piping. They acknowledge this openly, yet they continue to gather for her concerts with unwavering devotion. Her performances provide focus for communal attention that might otherwise remain scattered by the endless demands of survival. In these temporary spaces, the mouse people experience something that transcends their practical concerns, a shared aesthetic experience that creates collective identity and meaning. The objective quality of her art becomes irrelevant. What matters is its capacity to gather the community and provide them with experiences of transcendence otherwise unavailable in their survival-focused existence. This reveals something profound about art's true function. Josephine's concerts create temporary communities organized around aesthetic experience rather than economic necessity or political control. Her singing provides the mouse people with access to experiences that exceed their material circumstances, moments where they discover their capacity for something beyond mere survival. The narrator suggests that their appreciation of Josephine's performance reveals depths in mouse nature that practical life never allows them to explore. Art's value lies not in objective excellence, but in its power to create shared experience and meaning within community. Yet, Josephine's story takes a crucial turn. She gradually withdraws from public performance, eventually disappearing entirely. The narrator suggests this may represent the fulfillment rather than the failure of her artistic mission. Her absence allows the community to internalize what her presence provided, making external artistic authority unnecessary. The mouse people discover they can carry forward the collective meaning her performances created without requiring her continued presence. This points toward a profound possibility that authentic artistic expression might offer forms of liberation that operate independently of social recognition or institutional validation. Josephine's disappearance suggests that true art transcends the need for recognition, achieving its purpose through the community it creates rather than the fame it brings to its creator. Her withdrawal becomes itself an artistic act, demonstrating that the highest function of art may be to make itself unnecessary by awakening capacities within its audience that no longer require external prompting. The community she gathered continues to exist, enriched by the shared experiences her performances provided, but no longer dependent on her presence to access their own depths. In the final moments of the Metamorphosis, Gregor experiences something extraordinary. As he lies dying in his room, listening to his family discuss their need for him to disappear, he achieves perfect clarity about his situation. This recognition brings him not despair but peace, a profound acceptance that transcends the horror of his circumstances. Kafka reveals here something crucial about the nature of human understanding, that recognition itself possesses a value independent of its practical consequences. This moment of clarity illuminates a paradox at the heart of Kafka's philosophical vision. Gregor's recognition cannot save him, cannot restore his human form, cannot repair his relationships with his family. Yet it transforms his experience entirely. He sees with perfect lucidity that his continued existence has become a burden to those he loves, and this understanding grants him a form of dignity that his months of confusion and desperate hope could never provide. The truth, however painful, liberates him from the torment of false expectations. Joseph experiences a similar recognition in the final scene of the trial. As the knife turns in his heart, he sees his situation with absolute clarity, the nature of the court, the impossibility of his position, the futility of his struggles. This understanding comes too late to change anything. Yet it represents a profound achievement. He dies like a dog, but he dies knowing exactly what has happened to him. This knowledge, whilst practically useless, provides a form of completion that his year of bewildered resistance could not achieve. Recognition of one's situation constitutes a form of liberation, even when external circumstances remain unchanged. Characters who achieve clear understanding of their predicament experience a freedom unavailable to those who remain confused or self-deceptive about their circumstances. The hunger artist exemplifies this most powerfully in his final recognition that he fasted because he couldn't find the food one liked. This simple acknowledgement transforms his entire life story from failure into authentic spiritual quest. This transformation occurs not through changing facts, but through understanding their true meaning. The hunger artist's fasting remains the same physical act, but its significance shifts completely once he recognizes its authentic motivation. He discovers that what appeared to be artistic dedication was actually spiritual necessity, not a performance for others, but a genuine expression of his deepest nature. This recognition provides dignity and authenticity that false hope or self-deception cannot offer. Kafka suggests that truthful recognition of reality, however painful, possesses inherent value. His characters often suffer not primarily from their circumstances, but from their failure to understand those circumstances clearly. The confusion and self-deception that prevent recognition become forms of additional suffering layered upon already difficult situations. When characters finally see clearly, they often discover that the truth, whilst harsh, is more bearable than the anxiety of uncertainty. The reader's understanding frequently exceeds that of the characters, suggesting possibilities for awareness and recognition that extend beyond the fictional situations. Kafka's narrative techniques create opportunities for readers to see patterns and connections that remain invisible to the characters themselves. We recognize the futility of Josef K's legal strategies long before he does, understand the impossibility of Gregor's return to human form whilst he still hopes for recovery, see the hunger artist's authentic spirituality before he acknowledges it himself. This creates a form of philosophical education where readers develop capacities for recognizing similar patterns in their own experience. The stories function as training grounds for a particular kind of awareness, the ability to see through self-deception, to recognize systemic patterns that individuals cannot change, to distinguish between authentic and inauthentic responses to impossible situations. Kafka's interpretive complexity mirrors the hermeneutic challenges his characters face, making readers active participants in the search for meaning. Truth-telling becomes a form of resistance, even when it cannot change material conditions, providing dignity and authenticity that no system can finally eliminate. Part 11. Writing as philosophical practice. Kafka's stories operate according to dream logic, where impossible situations feel completely inevitable, creating a philosophical method that bypasses rational argumentation altogether. When Gregor Samson awakens, transformed into an insect, neither he nor his family questions the transformation itself. They immediately begin calculating how to manage work schedules and family finances around this new reality. The metamorphosis is presented as matter of fact, demanding practical adaptation rather than explanation or disbelief. This acceptance follows dream logic perfectly. In dreams, the most bizarre circumstances feel entirely natural whilst we experience them, only striking us as strange upon waking. Josef K's arrest operates through identical dream logic. Legal procedures unfold according to their own internal consistency, whilst violating every normal expectation about justice and rationality. Court sessions happen in attics, judges consult pornographic books, and defendants never learn their charges. Yet this system maintains perfect internal coherence. The court's logic is impeccable within its own terms. Just as dream narratives follow flawless internal causation that makes no sense by waking standards. This creates philosophical insights that rational discourse cannot achieve because it reveals how systems of power actually function beneath their rational facades. This method succeeds because dreams provide access to psychological truths that realistic representation cannot capture. Dream logic reveals connections between apparently unrelated aspects of experience. Work anxiety and family relationships, legal guilt and existential shame, bureaucratic procedures and spiritual seeking. Kafka described his writing process as emerging from dreamlike states where conscious control gave way to unconscious knowledge, allowing stories to explore psychological territories that realistic fiction cannot access because they operate below the threshold of rational consciousness. Gregor's transformation reveals connections between his job dissatisfaction, family dynamics, and existential alienation that were invisible when these appeared as separate problems. His disgust with traveling sales work, his resentment at supporting ungrateful family members, and his deep loneliness suddenly appear as aspects of a single condition. The insect body literalizes what was already true psychologically, His dehumanization was complete before the metamorphosis began. Dream logic makes visible what rational analysis misses: how personal identity, family obligation, and economic exploitation interpenetrate in ways that destroy authentic selfhood. Josef K's trial connects his professional identity, sexual relationships, and spiritual condition through dream logic that violates normal categories. His legal predicament cannot be separated from his treatment of women, his career ambitions, or his relationship to transcendence. The court proceedings reveal how these apparently distinct life domains actually form a unified existential condition. His guilt operates simultaneously as legal, sexual, professional, and spiritual failure, CEC, categories that realistic fiction would treat separately but dream logic shows as fundamentally interconnected. The absurd becomes a vehicle for profound insight, where irrationality illuminates what rationality conceals about modern existence. The apparent absurdity of men becoming insects, trials without crimes, and castles that cannot be reached actually provides more accurate representations of modern experience than realistic fiction that assumes rational causation and logical resolution. Dream logic captures the actual texture of life under bureaucratic capitalism, where rational individual action meets irrational systemic logic, creating experiences that feel simultaneously meaningful and meaningless. This philosophical method creates the foundation for stories that resist single interpretations whilst demanding to be interpreted, creating hermeneutic challenges that mirror the interpretive problems his characters face. Like dreams, Kafka's narratives generate multiple valid readings that cannot be synthesized into coherent explanations, forcing readers into the same position as his protagonists, seeking meaning in systems that provide endless interpretive possibilities without definitive answers. Kafka's stories possess a peculiar interpretive quality that makes them simultaneously irresistible to interpretation and resistant to definitive reading. The Metamorphosis invites analysis as social criticism of alienated labor, psychological study of family dynamics, existential parable about human transformation, and spiritual allegory about transcendence. Yet each interpretation, whilst revealing genuine insights, remains fundamentally incomplete. This interpretive excess is not accidental, but central to Kafka's philosophical method. The stories generate more meaning than any single reading can contain, creating what we might call interpretive surplus that mirrors the hermeneutic problems his characters face when trying to understand their own situations. Josef K. attempting to decode legal documents and procedures in the trial finds himself in precisely the same position as readers attempting to decode the meaning of his trial. Both character and reader encounter interpretive situations that demand understanding while systematically frustrating attempts to achieve it. The recursive nature of this hermeneutic situation becomes clear when the prison chaplain offers multiple interpretations of the parable before the law, each contradicting the others, each revealing new dimensions of meaning whilst obscuring others. The chaplain's interpretive proliferation demonstrates how the search for definitive meaning generates endless interpretive possibilities without ever reaching resolution. This interpretive complexity transforms readers from passive recipients of philosophical conclusions into active participants in the philosophical problems the stories explore. When we try to understand what Gregor's transformation means, we experience directly the interpretive urgency and frustration that characterizes modern existence. Each attempt to fix meaning reveals new layers of complexity requiring further interpretation, creating infinite regress, similar to the bureaucratic hierarchies Kafka's characters encounter. The castle's communications to K exemplify this perfectly. Every clarification requires further clarification. Every answer generates new questions. Every interpretation demands meta-interpretation. The deferral of final meaning in Kafka's work reflects the broader modern condition where traditional sources of interpretive authority no longer provide definitive answers to existential questions. Religion, tradition, and reason, the classical guarantors of meaning, have lost their interpretive sovereignty without being replaced by adequate alternatives. Kafka's own interpretive comments about his work typically add to, rather than resolve, interpretive complexity, suggesting that even authorial intention cannot serve as final interpretive authority. This creates interpretive situations that resist closure whilst maintaining interpretive urgency, leaving readers suspended in hermeneutic tension that cannot be definitively resolved. Through this process, readers become complicit in the search for meaning that the text simultaneously encourages and frustrates. The experience of trying to interpret Kafka's stories teaches us about the nature of interpretation itself, revealing the limits of rational understanding and the human need for meaning that exceeds what analytical reason can provide. This creates philosophical education through interpretive experience rather than doctrinal instruction, making readers aware of their own interpretive assumptions and desires, whilst demonstrating how meaning always escapes final capture. The fragmentary nature of Kafka's literary output reinforces this philosophical statement. Incompletion becomes not limitation, but insight into the nature of existence and understanding itself. Kafka's greatest works arrive incomplete, and this incompletion reveals something essential about the nature of philosophical investigation itself. The Trial and the Castle remained unfinished at his death, yet their fragmentary state seems not accidental but inevitable. How could a trial that criminalizes existence itself reach resolution? How could a quest for transcendent authority achieve final success? These investigations resist completion because they explore territories where completion becomes impossible or meaningless. Kafka instructed Max Brod to destroy his unpublished manuscripts, recognizing that these philosophical explorations might be fundamentally unsuited to the finality that publication represents. The fragment preserves what finished works foreclose. A.B. The openness and uncertainty that completion would resolve artificially. The castle breaks off without revealing whether K will ever reach his destination, and this unresolved ending preserves the essential mystery of his quest. Any definitive resolution would reduce the story's philosophical complexity to a simple message, transforming profound investigation into mere allegory. The trial ends abruptly at Josef K's execution, preserving the question of whether his death represents justice, murder, or something beyond these familiar categories. The fragmentary conclusion maintains the work's capacity to generate new interpretations across different historical moments. Each generation discovers fresh meanings in these incomplete investigations, because incompletion prevents the text from closing off interpretive possibilities. This fragmentary method reflects something fundamental about existence itself, which resists final systematization and always exceeds our attempts to understand it completely. Kafka's incomplete narratives mirror the actual texture of lived experience, which lacks the narrative closure and thematic unity that finished literary works typically impose. Most philosophical systems and completed narratives create artificial order, suggesting that reality possesses coherence and direction that experience rarely provides. Kafka's diary entries and letters reveal his own life as equally fragmentary and resistant to systematic understanding. His philosophical investigations emerge from this recognition that human existence unfolds without clear direction or ultimate meaning, making fragmentary representation more philosophically honest than systematic completion. The fragment creates a distinctive form of philosophical practice. Rather than providing closure, incomplete works invite continued thinking, generating ongoing engagement rather than completed systems. Readers must actively participate in constructing meaning from Kafka's unfinished investigations, making interpretation a creative process rather than passive reception of finished ideas. This transforms reading into philosophical practice, as the story's unresolved tensions generate continued reflection on the existential and political problems they explore. This fragmentary method establishes the foundation for understanding how Kafkaesque has become a distinct philosophical category. The term captures aspects of modern experience that systematic philosophy cannot adequately address. Sense of being trapped in incomprehensible processes, the experience of seeking meaning in systems that resist understanding, the recognition that completion and resolution might be impossible or undesirable when investigating the deepest questions of human existence. Kafka discovered that certain philosophical territories require fragmentary exploration because they concern aspects of reality that completion would betray or distort. Part 12. Kafka's reputation as an absurdist writer obscures his distinctive philosophical vision and reduces his complex exploration of meaning to a simpler position about meaninglessness. Critics routinely group him with Camus and Sartre as existentialist writers confronting the void, but this classification misses the specific nature of Kafka's philosophical contribution. Absurdist philosophy typically presents clear positions. Camus' conscious revolt against absurdity, Sartre's embrace of radical freedom. Cr. Whilst Kafka maintains a philosophical ambiguity that resists systematic formulation, this difference reflects fundamentally divergent approaches to the problem of meaning in modern existence, with Kafka occupying territory that systematic philosophy cannot easily map. Unlike Camus's revolt against absurdity, Kafka explores the possibility that apparent absurdity conceals hidden meaning that remains perpetually inaccessible to human understanding. Camus advocates active rebellion against meaninglessness through conscious affirmation of human values, creating heroes who achieve dignity through defiant assertion of their humanity. Kafka's characters remain suspended between meaninglessness and overdetermination, never achieving the clarity that would enable Camusian revolt. Josef K's trial exemplifies this suspension. It may represent either arbitrary persecution or cosmic justice, operating according to incomprehensible logic. The ambiguity cannot be resolved through heroic assertion of human values because the fundamental question of whether meaning exists remains unanswerable. This creates a more complex philosophical position that cannot be reduced to either affirmation or denial of meaning. This ambiguity captures the actual texture of modern experience more accurately than clearer philosophical positions that resolve the tension between meaning and meaninglessness. Most people live neither in Camusian revolt nor existentialist authenticity, but in the Kafkaesque condition of suspecting that their situation has meaning they cannot access whilst being unable to determine whether this suspicion is justified or delusional. Bureaucratic institutions feel simultaneously meaningful and absurd. The forms we complete, the procedures we follow, the hierarchies we navigate all seem to serve purposes that remain obscure. Professional roles create similar double binds. We sense that our work contributes to larger systems of meaning, whilst experiencing the daily reality as arbitrary and disconnected from any comprehensible purpose. Social relationships generate the same suspension between significance and emptiness. We participate in conversations, maintain connections, and fulfill obligations that feel both essential and hollow, both deeply meaningful and utterly conventional. Kafka explores this condition more precisely than philosophers who resolve the tension in favor of one side or the other, whether through Camusian rebellion or existentialist authenticity. His characters inhabit the space where most actual human experience occurs, the realm of suspected but inaccessible meaning. This distinctive vision makes Kafka's work more philosophically valuable than clearer positions, because it maintains the complexity and ambiguity that systematic philosophy tends to eliminate. His refusal to resolve fundamental tensions preserves philosophical problems in their full complexity rather than reducing them to manageable solutions. The question of whether K is guilty, whether the castle's authority is legitimate, whether Gregor's transformation reveals truth or represents delusion. These ambiguities cannot be resolved without destroying the philosophical insight they contain. Later, thinkers like Adorno and Benjamin recognized that certain philosophical problems cannot be solved, but must be maintained as ongoing sources of critical insight into the contradictions of modern existence. This approach creates the foundation for understanding how bureaucratic systems can evoke experiences traditionally associated with encounters with the divine, generating a secular form of mystical experience that neither affirms nor denies transcendence, but holds the question open indefinitely. Kafka's most profound philosophical insight emerges not from his analysis of alienation alone, but from his recognition that bureaucratic systems can evoke experiences traditionally associated with encounters with the divine. In The Trial, Josef K's interactions with court officials produce the same mixture of awe, terror, and fascination that mystics describe when encountering divine authority. The court's incomprehensible procedures and mysterious officials create what we might call a secular sublime, an experience of transcendence generated not by natural grandeur or divine presence, but by administrative complexity. This bureaucratic sublime operates through the same psychological mechanisms as religious experience. Josef K. approaches court proceedings with reverence, hope, and fear that mirror traditional religious devotion. The court's authority appears absolute, yet incomprehensible, demanding submission whilst remaining fundamentally mysterious. Officials speak in riddles, procedures follow hidden logic, and the entire system operates according to laws that exceed human understanding. This creates genuine religious experience within secular institutional frameworks, suggesting that bureaucracy functions as modernity's unconscious theology. The castle reveals this dynamic even more clearly through its infinite hierarchy of authority. Each official points beyond himself to higher authorities who remain perpetually inaccessible. K seeks audience with Clam, only to discover that Clam's authority derives from still higher officials, who themselves answer to authorities beyond reach. This infinite regress creates the same structure of transcendence that characterizes negative theology, God known only through absence, approached only through endless deferral of direct encounter. This analysis transforms our understanding of bureaucratic experience from mere social critique to philosophical anthropology. Kafka recognizes that humans require structures of transcendence and meaning that exceed immediate practical concerns. When traditional religious frameworks collapse under modernity's weight, bureaucratic systems unconsciously inherit their function. The castle's officials become simultaneously all-powerful and absent, present in their effects, but never directly accessible, precisely paralleling theological descriptions of divine hiddenness. Administrative procedures take on ritual significance that far exceeds their practical function. Court sessions become sacred ceremonies. Official appointments transform into pilgrimages. Document preparation assumes devotional character. These activities provide structure and meaning that organize entire communities around shared faith in bureaucratic authority. Characters develop genuine religious relationships with administrative processes, finding in bureaucratic complexity the same interpretive challenges and spiritual significance that mystics discover in divine encounter. This creates what Kafka reveals as modernity's hidden theology, a system of secular worship that provides transcendence through administrative rather than divine authority. The bureaucratic sublime offers genuine religious experience without religious content, creating communities of shared faith organized around institutional rather than divine mystery. This insight anticipates later developments in critical theory by diagnosing the theological dimensions hidden within apparently secular institutions, revealing how bureaucracy becomes modernity's unconscious religion. Kafka's literary works function as diagnostic instruments, revealing what rational discourse systematically fails to acknowledge about the psychological and social reality of modern life. His stories operate as symptoms in the clinical sense, involuntary expressions of conditions that consciousness cannot directly confront or articulate. Where social science presents institutions as rational systems serving clear functions, Kafka's narratives expose the hidden violence and mystification that operate within structures that present themselves as efficient, just, and reasonable. The anxiety, guilt, and alienation experienced by his characters represent not individual pathology, but accurate perceptions of their social conditions. Gregor Samsa's transformation into an insect expresses the literal truth of his position within economic relations that reduce human beings to disposable resources. Josef K's bewilderment before the legal system reflects the actual incomprehensibility of institutional authority that operates through procedures designed to mystify rather than clarify. These psychological symptoms diagnose social realities that rational analysis cannot access, because it remains trapped within the very frameworks that produce the conditions it attempts to understand. Kafka's literary method achieves insights unavailable to purely theoretical approaches, because it works through concrete representation rather than abstract analysis. His stories make visible the unconscious dimensions of modern experience. Inisi, the ways institutional power operates through the production of guilt, anxiety, and interpretive confusion that make resistance difficult, whilst maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. This anticipates developments in critical theory, psychoanalysis, and postmodern philosophy that would later systematize these insights. His analysis of bureaucratic authority prefigures Foucault's work on disciplinary power, showing how modern institutions control subjects, not through direct coercion, but through the internalization of surveillance and the production of self-regulating anxiety. His exploration of guilt anticipates psychoanalytic theories of superego formation, revealing how social authority becomes internalized as psychological structure. His analysis of language anticipates post-structuralist critiques of representation, showing how meaning becomes unstable under conditions of institutional power that systematically distort communication. Thinkers like Adorno, Benjamin, and Deleuze explicitly acknowledge Kafka's influence on their theoretical work, recognizing that his literary investigations provide insights that purely conceptual approaches cannot achieve. His concrete dramatizations of abstract social relations reveal mechanisms of domination that remain invisible to theoretical analysis operating at the level of general principles. The Kafkaesque names the return of the repressed within rationalized social systems. What modernity attempts to eliminate: mystery, transcendence, irrationality, say, returns in distorted forms within secular institutions. Bureaucratic procedures become mystical practices. Legal systems become theological tribunals. Administrative hierarchies become cosmic orders. This suggests that modernity's attempt to eliminate religious and metaphysical dimensions of experience only displaces them into secular institutions, where they operate unconsciously. This displacement creates more oppressive forms of transcendence because they cannot be recognized or criticized as religious phenomena. The castle operates as a theological authority that cannot be approached through theological categories. The court functions as a divine tribunal that cannot be understood through legal reasoning. These institutions exercise absolute power whilst maintaining the appearance of secular rationality. Understanding Kafka provides essential tools for diagnosing contemporary forms of alienation and control that operate through similar mechanisms in different institutional contexts. His analysis of bureaucratic authority illuminates contemporary experiences with corporate management structures, digital surveillance systems, and algorithmic control mechanisms that create similar experiences of powerlessness and mystification. Part 13. Conclusion. Franz Kafka's philosophical vision forms a complete system where each element reinforces and illuminates the others with devastating precision. His exploration of modern alienation reveals the psychological conditions that make bureaucratic control possible, whilst his analysis of guilt and deferred meaning shows how these systems perpetuate themselves through the very attempts to escape them. The individual trapped in bureaucratic machinery seeks meaning and resolution. But this seeking reproduces the system that created the need to seek. Transformation becomes both necessary and impossible. We recognize the arbitrariness of social identity whilst discovering how thoroughly these arbitrary structures have shaped our capacity for authentic change. This creates Kafka's most penetrating insight. Modern existence is characterized by the simultaneous overpresence and absence of meaning. We are controlled by systems that claim authority they cannot justify, creating experiences of being overdetermined by forces we cannot understand or influence. Bureaucratic systems generate endless interpretation and significance, whilst remaining fundamentally arbitrary. This produces the distinctively modern paradox of too much meaning and no meaning simultaneously, a predicament that cannot be resolved through traditional philosophical or religious resources which provide either clear meaning or clear meaninglessness. Traditional systems of authority, whether religious or political, at least offered coherent frameworks for understanding, suffering, and purpose. Modern bureaucratic systems offer neither redemption nor honest nihilism, but rather the exhausting experience of perpetual significance that signifies nothing. The trial continues indefinitely, not because justice is complex, but because the system requires the process of seeking justice more than any actual resolution. Kafka's lasting legacy lies in providing language for experiences that rational discourse cannot capture. The Kafkaesque names what it feels like to be human in systems designed for something else: bureaucratic efficiency, economic productivity, administrative control. His work gives conceptual form to experiences of powerlessness, mystification, and existential displacement that remain central to contemporary life under corporate capitalism, digital surveillance, and algorithmic governance. Kafkaesque has become indispensable vocabulary for describing institutional experiences that exceed other forms of social criticism, providing tools for recognition that remain politically and philosophically valuable. Yet whilst escape from these conditions may prove impossible, recognition and truthful description of them constitutes a form of freedom and dignity that no system can finally eliminate. Kafka's commitment to precise observation and honest representation creates spaces for awareness that bureaucratic and ideological discourse cannot colonize. His work demonstrates that the capacity for truthful recognition, artistic expression, and authentic witness provides forms of human dignity that remain available even under the most oppressive circumstances. This suggests that philosophy's highest achievement may not be providing solutions, but maintaining the capacity for clear seeing and honest description that prevents complete absorption into the systems that shape our existence. Kafka shows us that the human capacity for truthful observation remains inviolate, offering not escape, but the dignity of accurate witness. In a world of systematic mystification, precise description becomes a form of resistance that no authority can finally suppress.